14 hours, and you haven't made a sound, not a whimper, not a cough, not even a breath loud enough to hear. So either you're the best liar I've ever sat across from, or you think silence is going to save you." The fluorescent tube above the table buzzed at a frequency that made the shadows twitch. The detective leaned forward, both palms flat on the steel surface, his wedding ring clicking against the metal like a metronome counting down to something inevitable. The woman across from him did not move. Her hands rested on the table, wrists still bearing the faint red grooves where the handcuffs had been. Her eyes tracked his movements with the precision of someone cataloging evidence, not the darting, frightened gaze of a suspect, but the measured observation of a person who had spent decades watching people lie under oath and knew exactly what truth looked like when it was being strangled. He did not know that. He saw a black woman in a wrinkled blazer who refused to speak, and he interpreted her silence the way men like him always interpreted silence from women who looked like her, as defiance, as guilt, as something that needed to be broken. She was not being defiant. She was not being guilty. She was being mute. Had been since birth, the auditory nerve damage irreversible, the vocal cords functional but purposeless, without the neural architecture to shape sound into language. She communicated through American Sign Language and written text, had done so for 47 years, and had requested an interpreter 4 times since arriving at this precinct. 4 times. 0 interpreters. The detective shoved a yellow legal pad across the table. A pen rolled after it, stopping against her knuckles. "Write. Your name. Your address. Why you were at that restaurant, and why you ran when my officers approached." She had not run. She had stood up from her chair to show them the text on her phone, the phone they had confiscated 60 seconds later. She picked up the pen, wrote 4 words in block letters so clear they could have been typeset. "I need an interpreter." The detective read the words, read them again, then crumpled the paper into a ball and dropped it in the wastebasket beside his chair. Somewhere in this building, in a server rack humming behind a locked door, a body cam unit logged as equipment malfunction was still recording audio. Every word he had spoken, every silence she had offered, every violation of federal law he had committed without knowing he was building the case against himself. He read the words 3 times. Then he crumpled the paper and dropped it in the trash, as if silence could be thrown away. Dispatch log, case number 24-0719. Timestamp, 8:47 p.m. Call origin, Magnolia Grill, 412 South Main Street, Memphis. Caller reports, black female, mid-40s, seated alone, matching description of suspect in wallet theft. No weapon observed. No physical description beyond race, gender, and approximate age. The kind of description that could match 1,000 women in any city in America, and somehow always match the one who was already being watched. If you want to see what happens when this detective discovers exactly who he's been threatening for 14 hours, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on, because this story is only getting started. 6 hours earlier, the lobby of the Peabody Memphis smelled like brass polish and old money. Crystal chandeliers threw fractured light across marble floors that had been walked by governors and cotton kings and civil rights leaders whose names were etched into plaques no one bothered to read anymore. The famous ducks paddled in their fountain, indifferent to the humans milling around them with lanyards and conference badges. Vivian Oakes stood at the registration desk with her rolling briefcase squared precisely behind her left ankle, and her confirmation number displayed on her phone screen, turned outward so the clerk could read it without leaning. The clerk, a young white woman with immaculate nails and a smile that had been practiced in a mirror, glanced at the phone, then at Vivian, then at the phone again. "I'm sorry, could you repeat the name? I'm having trouble finding the reservation." Vivian held the phone steady. The screen read, "Vivian R. Oakes. Confirmation number PB-7741, 6th Circuit Judicial Conference." She had typed it in 26-point font specifically because hotel clerks had a habit of squinting at her screen and asking her to repeat things she had never said out loud in the first place. The clerk typed, frowned, typed again. And you're here for the... She glanced at the screen again. The conference? Are you with the catering team, or... Vivian's expression did not change. She had been mistaken for the help at 14 conferences in 11 years. The number was not approximate. She kept count the way some people kept score, not out of bitterness, but out of the disciplined habit of documenting patterns that others preferred to call coincidence. She swiped to a second screen on her phone, where she had pre-typed, "I am a conference attendee. I am deaf-mute and communicate through text and ASL. My room is reserved under Oaks, confirmation PB 7741. The clerk's smile tightened. Not cruelty, discomfort. The particular discomfort of a person who has never had to think about how communication works until confronted with someone for whom it works differently. Of course, I'm so sorry, Ms. Oaks. Let me just... Yes, here it is. Room 1114, 11th floor. She slid the keycard across the counter with the exaggerated gentleness people reserved for interactions they wanted to end quickly. Vivian took the card, nodded once, and walked toward the elevators without looking back. Her shoes made no sound on the marble. She moved through the lobby the way water moves through stone, present, patient, wearing grooves that would only be visible years from now. Room 1114. She entered, set her briefcase upright beside the closet door, and began her routine. It was the same routine she performed in every hotel room, every courthouse chamber, every unfamiliar space she occupied for more than 30 minutes. She checked the deadbolt, tested the swing lock, opened the window 3 inches to verify it sealed properly when closed, noted the fire exit, end of the hallway, 14 doors to the left, stairwell descending to the east side of the building. She wrote the room number, floor, and exit distance in a pocket notebook she carried in her blazer, the same notebook she had carried for 23 years, replaced every 6 months, the old ones filed in chronological order in a fireproof cabinet at home. Her clothes went into the dresser drawers in the order she would need them. Tomorrow's outfit on top, sleepwear beneath, workout clothes at the bottom. Toiletries lined the bathroom counter left to right. Cleanser, toner, moisturizer, toothbrush, toothpaste. Each item parallel to the counter's edge with the labels facing forward. Her briefcase stayed upright, combination lock set to a sequence she changed monthly. This was not obsession. This was architecture. The architecture of a mind that processed the world through sight and touch and spatial awareness rather than sound. A mind that compensated for one missing sense by sharpening every other one to a degree that most people would find exhausting, and she found essential. She changed into a charcoal dress. Simple, well cut. The kind of garment that communicated seriousness without demanding attention. Earrings, small gold studs, no necklace, no perfume. She had learned early that the less ornamentation she wore, the harder it was for people to categorize her, and the harder it was to categorize her, the more honestly they eventually treated her. Eventually. The Magnolia Grill occupied the ground floor of a converted warehouse on South Main, all exposed brick and reclaimed wood, and a menu that charged $42 for a steak and called it heritage beef. Vivian had chosen it because it was 3 blocks from the hotel, well reviewed, and, according to the accessibility page on its website, compliant with ADA requirements for auxiliary aids and services. The hostess, blonde, early 20s, a smile that belonged on a tourism brochure, looked up when Vivian approached the stand. Vivian held out her phone. Reservation for Oaks. 7:30 p.m., table for 1. The hostess studied the screen, studied Vivian, picked up a menu. Of course, right this way, Ms. She led Vivian past the main dining room, past the window tables with their views of the streetcar line, past the elevated VIP section, where a table of 6 was already deep into their second bottle of wine, and deposited her at a 2-top wedged between the kitchen entrance and the restroom hallway. Vivian's reservation had specified table 9, a window seat. This was table 23. She knew because the small brass number was bolted to the wall above the wainscoting, and because she had memorized the restaurant's floor plan from its website before arriving. She did not protest, did not type a complaint, did not signal displeasure in any way that would give anyone a story to tell later about the difficult woman who made a scene. She sat down, opened the menu, and began reading it with the focused attention she gave to every document, left to right, top to bottom, missing nothing. The manager appeared 6 minutes later. Wade Purcell. She knew his name because it was printed on the small placard at the hostess stand. Wade Purcell, general manager. He was mid-50s, silver-templed, with the practiced warmth of a man who had spent decades making wealthy people feel welcome, and everyone else feel grateful for being allowed inside. "Good evening. I hope the table is satisfactory. We had a last-minute adjustment to the seating arrangement, a private party in the main room." He gestured vaguely toward the window section, where no private party was visible. "I trust this will be comfortable for you." It was not comfortable. It was strategic. She had been moved away from the VIP area, away from the windows, away from the sightlines of guests whose comfort apparently required that she be invisible. But comfort was a negotiation she could conduct later through proper channels, with documentation. Tonight, she was here to eat dinner, review her conference notes, and return to her hotel by 9:30. She nodded at Purcell. He retreated. The server arrived, young, earnest, briefly confused when Vivian pointed to her selections on the menu and communicated through typed text on her phone rather than speaking. But the server adapted quickly, confirmed the order by reading it back aloud for Vivian to nod or shake her head, and disappeared toward the kitchen with professional efficiency. The steak arrived medium rare, as ordered. The roasted vegetables were overcooked by approximately 2 minutes, which she noted but did not complain about. The water glass was refilled twice without her having to signal. Small mercies. Small normalcies. The kind of evening that should not have required courage, but did, because eating alone in a restaurant while black and female and unable to speak was an act of visibility that invited judgment from every direction. She was reviewing the conference agenda on her phone, tomorrow's panel on judicial ethics, the afternoon session on courtroom technology, when the screaming started. The sound came from the VIP section, a woman's voice, high and sharp, cutting through the ambient noise of dinner conversation like a siren through fog. "My wallet is gone. Someone took it. It was right here in my purse, and now it's gone." The woman was standing beside her chair, clutching a designer handbag with the flap open. Her face flushed the particular shade of red that expensive wine and sudden outrage produce in combination. Her dining companions, 3 men in sport coats, 2 women in cocktail dresses, looked embarrassed. The nearest server looked terrified. Purcell materialized from the kitchen corridor, his manager's instincts activated before his brain had fully processed the situation. "Ma'am, I assure you, I want the police called. Right now. Someone in this restaurant stole my wallet, and I want them found." Purcell's hand was already on his phone. The call lasted 90 seconds. Vivian watched from table 23, 14 feet away, partially obscured by the half wall separating the main dining room from the VIP section. She watched because watching was what she did, observing without being observed, processing details that other people's conversations drowned out, but that her silence amplified into high-definition clarity. She saw Purcell glance in her direction twice during the phone call. Brief glances, quickly redirected, but she caught them both. She had spent a lifetime reading the body language that accompanied the words she could not hear, and Purcell's body was saying something, his mouth had not yet spoken. "I know who the police should talk to first." The officers arrived at 8:53 p.m. 2 uniforms. The first, Darla Fenn, according to the nameplate Vivian read as the officer crossed the dining room, was compact, purposeful, with the hyper-alert posture of someone who approached every call as a potential confrontation. Her partner, Trey Holbrook, was taller, younger, and already scanning the room with the unfocused gaze of a man who had not yet learned to see. Purcell intercepted them at the entrance to the VIP section. He spoke rapidly, gesturing first toward the victim's table, then, with a subtlety that was not subtle at all, toward table 23, toward Vivian. Vivian set down her fork. Her steak was half finished, her water glass was full. Her phone lay on the table beside her plate, screen still displaying the conference agenda. She did not reach for it yet. She watched the geometry of the conversation shift. Purcell pointing, Fenn nodding, Holbrook following his partner's gaze until all three of them were looking at the black woman eating alone at the table by the kitchen door. The description the victim had given, Vivian would learn later, was this: black female, 40s, sitting alone. 3 data points: race, approximate age, solitude. A description so vague it functioned not as identification, but as accusation. The accusation being that a black woman's presence in an expensive restaurant was itself sufficient grounds for suspicion. Fenn approached table 23 with her right hand resting on her duty belt. Not on her weapon, on the belt itself, the thumb hooked behind the radio, the posture that communicated readiness without technically constituting a threat. The posture that would look professional in a report and aggressive in a courtroom, depending on who was reading. "Evening, ma'am. Can I see some identification, please?" Vivian reached for her phone. Not quickly, deliberately, with the controlled precision of a person who understood that reaching for objects during police encounters required telegraphing every movement. She unlocked the screen, opened her text-to-speech app, and held it up so Fenn could read the display. The screen read, "I am deaf-mute. I communicate through text and ASL. I need a qualified interpreter. My ID is in my wallet in my purse on the chair beside me." Fenn read the screen. Her expression did not change. Not sympathy, not understanding, not even the brief recalculation that should have occurred when an officer realizes a suspect has a disability that fundamentally alters how communication must be conducted. "Ma'am, I need verbal confirmation of your identity. Can you state your name for me?" Vivian blinked once. She had just explained, in clear, grammatically precise English, that she could not produce verbal anything. That verbal was the one modality permanently closed to her. That asking her to speak was like asking a person in a wheelchair to stand. She typed again, holding the phone steady. "I cannot speak. Mute since birth. Please read my previous message. I am requesting a qualified ASL interpreter per ADA Title 2 and Tennessee. Code annotated section 24-1-103. Please document this request." The language was precise, clinical, the kind of language a person used when they knew that precision would matter later, in depositions, in hearings, in the formal proceedings that transformed lived experience into legal record. But it was not the language of a lawyer or a judge. It was the language of a citizen who knew her rights. Any citizen could know these things. Many did. Fenn glanced at Holbrook. Something passed between them. Not words, but the shared understanding of partners who had already decided what this encounter was and were now just going through the motions of pretending it could be anything else. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to put the phone down." Fenn's hand extended, not requesting, taking. She pulled the phone from Vivian's fingers with a motion that was half confiscation, half swat, the screen going dark as Fenn pressed it against her thigh. Vivian's hands went to the table. Palms flat. Fingers spread. The universal posture of compliance, but also the posture of a person whose only remaining tool for communication had just been removed, and who now had no way to speak, no way to sign with hands that would soon be cuffed, no way to exist in language at all. She reached into her purse, slowly, visibly, and withdrew her driver's license, held it out. Fenn took it, studied it, passed it to Holbrook without comment. Posted notice. Magnolia Grill front entrance, framed in black. Behind the hostess stand, this establishment complies with all Americans with Disabilities Act requirements. Auxiliary aids and services available upon request. Please ask any staff member for assistance. The sign had been there for 6 years. The restaurant had never once provided an ASL interpreter. The compliance was decorative. The promise was wallpaper. Fenn's radio crackled. She stepped 3 feet away, spoke into it with her back half turned. The posture of exclusion. The deliberate creation of a conversation Vivian could not access, even if she could hear. Holbrook stood beside the table, not quite blocking Vivian's exit, but positioned so that leaving would require passing within arm's reach of a uniformed officer. Fenn returned. "Stand up, please. Turn around. Hands behind your back." Vivian did not move, not from defiance, from the need to communicate one more thing before her hands were taken from her. She grabbed a cloth napkin from the table, pulled a pen from the small holder beside the salt shaker, and wrote in letters large enough to read from 3 feet away. "I did not steal anything. I have been seated here for 1 hour. Your body cam is recording. I am requesting an interpreter." Fenn read the napkin, folded it, put it in her pocket. "Hands, behind your back, now." The cuffs clicked shut over Vivian's wrists, behind her back, not in front, which meant her hands were now locked in a position that made sign language impossible. The one accommodation that would have cost nothing, cuffing her in front so she could still fingerspell, was denied either through ignorance or intention, and the result was the same regardless of which. Vivian Oakes was now a woman without language. Purcell watched from the hostess stand, arms folded, nodding to himself with the satisfied expression of a man who believed he had solved a problem. The other diners watched too, some with curiosity, some with discomfort, none with the urgency that might have produced intervention. A black woman being handcuffed in a restaurant was not, apparently, unusual enough to interrupt dessert. They led her through the main dining room, past the VIP section, where the victim was already back in her seat, scrolling through her phone, her outrage having completed its useful life cycle. Past table 9, the window seat that should have been Vivian's, where 2 white women were splitting a chocolate torte. Past the front door, where the ADA compliance sign hung in its black frame, promising services it had never delivered. Into the back of the patrol car. The door shut with the heavy final sound of a system closing around a person it had decided was guilty before asking a single question it was willing to hear the answer to. Vivian sat in the back seat and began counting. Not seconds. Turns. Left turn out of the parking lot. Right onto Union Avenue. Straight for approximately 4 minutes. Right again. The precinct would be on the left. She had mapped Memphis before arriving. Not the tourist map of Beale Street and barbecue joints, but the infrastructure map, hospitals, police stations, courthouses, fire departments. The architecture of a city's emergency systems memorized the way other travelers memorized restaurant recommendations. She counted 7 turns before the car stopped. The engine died. The door opened. Hands guided her out, not roughly, not gently, with the mechanical indifference of a system processing another unit through intake. Precinct South, Shelby County. The building smelled like floor wax and stale coffee, and the particular institutional despair that accumulates in places where people are brought against their will. The booking desk was a counter of bulletproof glass and institutional beige, staffed by a man whose nameplate read Sergeant Nolan, Trask, and whose face read boredom approaching hostility. He was mid-40s, thick through the shoulders, with the kind of posture that suggested he had once cared about fitness and now only cared about the end of his shift. Fenn removed the cuffs, finally, and Vivian's hands came forward with the slow, aching relief of joints restored to positions they were designed for. The red marks on her wrists were already darkening toward bruise. Name. Trask did not look up from his keyboard. Vivian rubbed her wrists, flexed her fingers, then raised both hands and signed, "My name is Vivian Oakes. I am deaf-mute. I need an ASL interpreter before any questioning can proceed." Trask watched her hands move with the expression of a man watching a foreign film without subtitles, not confused exactly, but unwilling to invest the effort required to understand. "English, please. Name, date of birth, address." Vivian looked for paper. There was a stack of intake forms on the counter, just beyond her reach. She pointed to them, then mimed writing. Trask slid one sheet across the counter. Vivian picked up the attached pen, chained to the clipboard with a beaded metal cord that allowed approximately 14 inches of movement, and wrote in the margin, "I cannot speak. I am mute. I need a qualified ASL interpreter before any questioning. This is my 5th request. Please log this request in the official record." Trask read the note. His upper lip curled. Not a smile, not a sneer. Something in between that communicated amusement and dismissal simultaneously. "She can't talk." He said it to Fenn, not to Vivian, as if she were a piece of evidence rather than a person. "Or won't talk." "Won't cooperate verbally," Fenn corrected. And the distinction was everything. The difference between a disability and a choice. Between accommodation and compliance. Between federal law and departmental convenience. She writes, she can write her information. Then she can write it on the intake form like everyone else. Trask pushed the form closer. Name, date of birth, address, standard booking. Vivian wrote her name, her date of birth, her home address in Memphis, a detail that should have prompted questions about why a local resident was being treated like a transient suspect, but did not. She wrote clearly, in block letters, each word a small act of compliance that cost her nothing, and gave them nothing they could use to justify what they were doing. But beneath her name, in smaller letters, she added, "This form is being completed under protest. I have not been provided with a qualified interpreter as required by ADA Title II, 42, USC, Section 1, 2, 13, 2, and 28 CFR Section 35.16. I do not waive any rights." Trask read the addendum. His expression shifted, not to concern, but to the particular irritation of a bureaucrat who has encountered a complication that will require additional paperwork. "What is this? A lawsuit?" He looked at Fenn. "She's citing statutes." "Everybody's a lawyer," Fenn said. "Book her. Let the detective sort it out." What this detective is about to do in that interrogation room will be recorded by every camera and microphone he doesn't know is still running. If you're watching this story unfold, hit that like button, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about this woman. The intake process continued with the mechanical indifference of a system that had processed thousands of bodies and would process thousands more, each one reduced to a form number and a cell assignment. Fingerprints. Vivian's fingers pressed onto the digital scanner with the flat resignation of a pianist being forced to play scales on a broken instrument. Photograph. Front-facing. Side profile. The camera flash harsh enough to bleach expression from any face. Property inventory. Purse contents laid out on the counter and cataloged by Fenn while Trask typed. Wallet, keys, hotel keycard, conference badge. 6th Circuit Judicial Conference. Attendee, which Fenn picked up, read, and set aside without comment. Lip balm. Breath mints. A pocket notebook, leather-bound, filled with small, precise handwriting. And the phone. Fenn held the phone for a moment, turning it over in her hand. It was locked, password protected. She set it on the counter beside the other items. Trask began filling out the property inventory form. Vivian watched his pen move across the boxes. Wallet, yes. Keys, yes. Keycard, yes. Notebook, yes. Phone. His pen hovered over the line. Moved to the next item. Skipped the phone entirely. Vivian tapped the counter. Pointed to the phone. Pointed to the inventory form. Tapped the counter again. Trask didn't look up. Sign here. Vivian pulled the form toward her and read it. 7 items listed. 8 items on the counter. The phone, her primary communication device, her accessibility tool, her connection to language itself, was not on the list. She wrote in the margin, "Phone not listed on inventory. 1 Samsung Galaxy, black case, confiscated at scene by Officer Fenn. Please add to record." "The form's complete," Trask said. "Sign it or don't." She did not sign. She drew a line through the signature box and wrote, "Refused. Inventory incomplete. Phone not documented." She underlined the word phone twice. Fenn and Trask exchanged a look. not concern, coordination, the silent negotiation of people who understood that documentation was the enemy of discretion, and that an unlogged phone was a phone that had never existed, had never been confiscated, had never contained text messages requesting interpreters that were never provided. Fenn slid the phone off the counter and into her jacket pocket. Not the evidence bag, not the property locker. Her pocket. The distinction would matter later. Vivian noted it, the pocket, the left side, the way Fenn's hand pressed against the fabric to confirm the phone was secure, and filed it in the growing catalog of violations she was building in her mind, the way an architect builds a blueprint, each observation a load-bearing wall in a structure that would eventually support the full weight of accountability. They walked her down a corridor that smelled like bleach and regret. Past the holding cells, 3 of them, 2 occupied by men sleeping on metal benches, 1 empty and waiting for her. Past the interrogation rooms, 2 doors, 1 marked A, 1 marked B, both closed. Past a bulletin board with departmental notices, training schedules, and, in the lower right corner, partially obscured by a flyer for a softball tournament, a laminated card, Shelby County Sheriff's Office. ADA Accommodation Request Form, SC-ADA-7, available at booking desk upon request. Vivian stopped, pointed at the card, looked at Fenn. Fenn kept walking. Move. They put her in the empty cell, metal bench, stainless steel toilet with no seat, a blanket folded on the bench that might once have been blue. The door closed with the particular sound of metal locking against metal that means you are no longer a person with choices. Vivian sat on the bench, straightened her spine, placed both hands on her knees, and began the work she had been doing since the handcuffs first clicked shut, organizing the evidence. Not on paper, not on a phone she no longer possessed, in her mind, in the filing system she had built over decades of professional practice, the mental architecture of someone whose career depended on organizing vast quantities of information into coherent narratives that could withstand cross-examination. Officer Fenn, badge number 4721. First contact, 8:53 p.m. at Magnolia Grill. Confiscated phone without issuing a receipt. Failed to request interpreter upon learning of disability. Cuffed hands behind back, eliminating sign language capability. Pocket confiscated phone outside of evidence protocol. Inventory form. Phone omitted. Sergeant Trask. Booking desk. Refused interpreter request. Request number 5. Logged disability as uncooperative. Completed inventory without documenting phone. Described sign language as won't cooperate verbally. Mischaracterization of disability as behavioral choice. Officer Holbrook, badge number. She paused. She had not caught Holbrook's badge number at the restaurant. The light had been wrong. He had been standing at an angle. She noted the gap and moved on. Gaps could be filled later. Patterns could not be reconstructed later if they were not identified in real time. Time, approximately 9:48 p.m. Location, cell 4B. Intake complete. No interpreter provided. No Miranda rights delivered in accessible format. No access to counsel offered. She sat. She waited. And in the silence that was both her disability and her weapon, she continued building the case that no one in this building knew was being built. 2 hours passed. The cell was cold. Not dangerously cold, not uncomfortably cold, but precisely cold enough to keep a person from sleeping. The fluorescent light above the bench did not turn off. The men in the adjacent cells snored at different frequencies, creating a polyrhythmic soundtrack of incarceration that Vivian could not hear but could feel through the vibrations in the metal bench beneath her. At 11:20 p.m., the cell door opened. Not for her, for the escort. A uniformed officer she had not seen before stood in the doorway with the expression of someone completing a task they found beneath them. Interrogation. Come with me. Vivian stood, followed, walked the corridor with her back straight and her eyes forward, counting doors. Interrogation room B. The officer opened it, stood aside, and waited for her to enter like a bellhop at a hotel that charged by the hour. The room was exactly what she expected. Metal table bolted to the floor. 2 chairs, one on each side, neither designed for comfort. A mirror on the right wall that might be observation glass or might be nothing more. Then reflective surface. Impossible to determine from this side, which was the entire point. And in the upper corner, mounted where the ceiling met the wall at an angle designed to cover the maximum area of the room, a camera. She studied the camera without appearing to study it. The lens angle, the field of coverage, the small red light that should have been blinking if it were active but was not blinking, which meant either the camera was off, or the recording light had been disabled, or the unit was functioning in audio-only mode with the visual indicator disconnected. She noted the camera's position, calculated the approximate blind spot, a triangular area along the left wall, approximately 3 feet wide at floor level, narrowing to nothing at the ceiling, and chose the chair that placed her fully within the camera's field of view. Not the chair they wanted her to sit in, the other one. She sat in the detective's chair. It was a small act of spatial intelligence that most people would not have noticed, but that spoke to a particular understanding of how rooms were designed to control behavior. The suspect's chair was positioned with its back to the mirror, a deliberate arrangement that produced psychological discomfort, the sense of being watched from behind, the vulnerability of exposure without visibility. The detective's chair faced the mirror, faced the door, faced the camera, the power chair, the chair of someone who expected to control the conversation. Vivian sat in it and waited for the detective who did not know he had already lost the room. Detective Bryce Kellum entered 4 minutes later. He was tall, 6'2", maybe 6'3", with the build of a man who had been athletic in college and had maintained just enough of it to still intimidate. His badge hung from a chain around his neck. His sleeves were rolled to the forearm, showing the veins and tendons of someone who wanted you to know he worked with his hands. His eyes were sharp, quick, the eyes of a man who had conducted hundreds of interrogations and believed he could read anyone who sat across from him within the first 30 seconds. He looked at Vivian, looked at the chair she was sitting in, looked at the chair she was supposed to be sitting in. His jaw tightened. "Wrong chair!" 2 words, not a request. Vivian did not move. He crossed the room in 3 strides, gripped the back of her chair, and pulled, dragging the chair backward with Vivian still in it, metal legs screaming against the concrete floor, her body jerking with the sudden motion. He repositioned the chair on the suspect's side of the table, the side with its back to the mirror, the side designed to make people feel small. Vivian's hands gripped the seat edges during the drag. When the chair stopped, she released them, placed her palms flat on the table, and looked up at Kellum with an expression that contained no fear, no anger, and no submission. Just observation. The clinical, dispassionate observation of a person documenting evidence. Kellum sat in his chair, dropped a manila folder on the table, opened it. Inside, the intake form with Vivian's handwriting. Fenn's incident report. A printed photo. A grainy still from the restaurant's security camera showing a figure in dark clothing near the VIP section. The figure could have been anyone. The figure could have been a shadow, but it was labeled Suspect, Oakes, V, in handwriting that matched Fenn's. Vivian Oakes. He read the name from the form, pronouncing it the way people pronounce words they expect to use as weapons. Age 47, Memphis resident, no priors. He looked up. "So what happened tonight, Vivian? You want to tell me about the wallet?" Vivian raised her hands and signed, "I need an ASL interpreter. I cannot speak. I have made this request 6 times. Please provide an interpreter before any questioning." Kellum watched her hands. Not with confusion, with contempt. The contempt of a man who believed he was being performed to, who interpreted her signing as theater rather than necessity, who had already decided that her silence was tactical rather than biological. "Cut the act. I've been doing this 15 years. You can hear me fine. I can see it in your eyes. You're tracking every word. So drop the sign language routine and talk to me." He was right about one thing. She could track his words, not by hearing them, but by reading his lips, his facial expressions, the micro movements of his jaw and tongue that she had learned to decode over 4 decades of navigating a world that insisted on speaking to her, in a language she could see but never produce. Lip reading was not hearing. It was translation, imperfect, exhausting, dependent on lighting and angle, and the speaker's willingness to face her directly, which Kellum was doing now only because he wanted her to see his authority, not because he understood her need. She reached for the yellow legal pad on the table, picked up the pen, wrote, "I am deaf-mute. This is not an act. I cannot produce speech. I need a qualified ASL interpreter. This is my 7th request." Kellum read the note. His nostrils flared. He tore the page from the pad, crumpled it, and dropped it in the wastebasket. "Write something useful or don't write at all. Name of your accomplice, where the wallet is, how you planned it. Those are the things I need from you. Not," he gestured at the crumpled paper, "that." Vivian pulled the legal pad back, wrote, "I did not steal anything. I was eating dinner alone. I was seated at table 23 for over 1 hour before officers arrived. The restaurant has security cameras that will confirm my location for the entire evening. I am requesting legal counsel and an ASL interpreter. Please document this request." This time, he did not crumple the paper. He read it, set it aside, and leaned forward with his elbows on the table, closing the distance between them to something less than professional and more than comfortable. "You know what I think? I think you can talk. I think you've been sitting in that cell for 2 hours working on your story, rehearsing the whole deaf-mute routine because you know it makes things complicated. You know we have to get an interpreter, file the paperwork, wait for someone to show up at..." He checked his watch. "Midnight on a Tuesday. And by the time all that happens, the wallet's been passed to someone else, the cash is gone, and you walk out with a disability claim and a lawsuit." He sat back. "I've seen it before." He had not seen it before. No detective in the history of American law enforcement had ever encountered a suspect who faked muteness to complicate a wallet theft investigation. The scenario existed only in the particular fiction that Kellum's ego required, the fiction in which he was always the smartest person in the room, always seeing through. Deceptions that fooled lesser investigators, always one step ahead of criminals, whose sophistication he simultaneously overestimated and misidentified. Vivian wrote, "I have been mute since birth. My medical records are available through my physician, Dr. Caroline Hess, Memphis ENT Associates. I can provide authorization for release of those records. Please contact Dr. Hess to verify." Kellum pushed the legal pad aside, not off the table, just far enough that writing on it would require Vivian to reach, to extend her body across the space he controlled, to make herself physically vulnerable in order to communicate. "Let me make this simple." His voice dropped, not to a whisper, to the register men use when they want you to understand that what follows is not a conversation but an ultimatum. "You can write me a confession. We process you, you get a court date, you go home tonight. Or," he let the word hang, "you can keep playing the silent treatment and I can hold you for 48 hours while I build a case that doesn't need your cooperation. Your choice." He leaned forward again, and this time his hand came down on the legal pad, flat, palm covering the entire surface, pinning it to the table, removing her last tool for communication. "Clock's ticking, Vivian." She met his eyes, held them, in the silence between them, the silence that was his impatience and her existence. Something shifted. Not visibly, not in any way he would recognize until much later, when the consequences arrived in forms he had never imagined. But the shift was real. The moment when a person who has been patient decides that patience has served its purpose, and what comes next will be built from different materials entirely. She reached across the table, slowly, deliberately, her hand entering the space his palm occupied on the legal pad. She did not touch his hand. She slid 2 fingers under the edge of the pad and pulled it toward her with a motion so precise it separated the paper from his palm, without making contact with his skin. She wrote, "You have held me for over 3 hours without providing an interpreter, without delivering Miranda rights in an accessible format, and without probable cause for arrest. The victim's description, black female, 40s, sitting alone, does not constitute identification, will not confess to a crime I did not commit. I will not speak because I cannot speak. And I will remember every word you have said in this room." She underlined the last sentence. Then she set the pen down, folded her hands on the table, and waited. Kellum read the note. His face reddened, not with shame, but with the particular fury of a man who has been outmaneuvered by someone he has decided is beneath him. He stood. The chair scraped backward with a sound that filled the room like an accusation. "Fine." He scooped up the manila folder, the legal pad, the pen. "Sit there, in the dark, in the silence." He smiled, a smile with no warmth, no humor, just teeth. "That's what you want, right? Silence? I'll give you all the silence you can handle." He left. The door slammed. The lock engaged. Vivian sat in the detective's absence and listened to the silence he thought was punishment. But silence had never been punishment to her. Silence was home. Silence was the architecture of her mind, the space where she organized information, constructed arguments, dismantled lies, and built the frameworks of justice that she delivered from a bench in a courtroom he had never entered and would never forget. She did not know that yet. The bench, the courtroom, the title. Those were details that belonged to a future still being assembled. For now, she was a woman in a room, alone with her silence, building a case from memory because they had taken everything else. The door opened again at 12:15 a.m. Not Kellum this time. Lieutenant Sheila Winsett entered the room the way weather enters a house, gradually, inevitably, filling every corner until there was no space left that she did not occupy. Winsett was mid-50s, white, with auburn hair cut to the jawline, and the posture of a woman who had spent 3 decades proving she belonged in rooms that did not want her and had internalized the gatekeeping so thoroughly that she now performed it instinctively on others. She wore a blazer over her badge, not hiding it, but contextualizing it, communicating that she was authority with style, power with presentation. She carried a different folder, thicker, newer, and a tablet that she set on the table screen up, displaying what appeared to be Vivian's driver's license photo next to a series of database queries. "Ms. Oakes?" Not Vivian. Ms. The formality was deliberate, the formality of a woman who understood that names were weapons and chose hers carefully. "I'm Lieutenant Winsett. I oversee the Detective Bureau. I understand there's been some—" She paused, selecting the word with visible care. "Miscommunication." Vivian signed. "Miscommunication requires 2 parties attempting to communicate. Only one party in this interaction has attempted communication. The other has refused to accommodate." Winsett watched the signing with polite incomprehension. "I'm sorry. I don't understand sign language. If you could write—" Vivian gestured toward the door. Kellum had taken the legal pad and the pen. The room contained no writing implements. Winsett had brought her own tablet, but no stylus, no paper, no accommodation of any kind for a person who had been asking for accommodation since 8:53 p.m. Winsett produced a pen from her blazer pocket and slid a sheet of paper across the table. Not a legal pad, a single sheet from a printer tray, the kind of paper that communicated temporary engagement rather than serious documentation. Vivian wrote, "This is my 8th request for an ASL interpreter. The time is approximately 12:15 a.m. I have been in custody since approximately 8:53 p.m., over 3 hours. No interpreter has been provided. No Miranda rights have been delivered in accessible format. No access to legal counsel has been offered. I am documenting these facts for the record." Winsett read the note with the expression of a woman reading a restaurant bill she intended to dispute. "Ms. Oakes, I understand your frustration, but interpreter services are," she gestured vaguely, "limited at this hour. We've reached out. These things take time." They had not reached out. No call had been made to any interpreter service. No request had been logged in the departmental system. Vivian could not prove this yet, but she suspected it because 3.5 hours was not a timeline consistent with effort. 3.5 hours was a timeline consistent with indifference. In the meantime, Winsett continued, opening her folder, I'd like to discuss the circumstances of tonight's incident. Your background check. Came back clean. No priors, no warrants, no flags. That's good. That works in your favor. She paused. But I do have some questions about your presence at the restaurant. Vivian waited, pen ready. A woman dining alone at a restaurant that charges $40 for an entree, paying cash, no phone visible, not speaking to anyone for over an hour. Winsett recited the details like evidence in a closing argument. You don't find that pattern unusual? Because in my experience, people who dine alone in expensive restaurants and pay cash and don't interact with anyone, they're not usually there for the food. The implication was clear enough to taste. The insinuation that Vivian's solitude was not preference but cover, that her cash payment was not convenience but concealment, that her silence was not disability but deception, that a black woman alone with money and quietness must be performing some act that required investigation. Vivian wrote, I dine alone frequently. I pay cash because it is my preference. I do not interact verbally because I cannot interact verbally. I am mute. I have been mute for 47 years. Your line of questioning is based on the assumption that my disability is suspicious behavior. It is not. It is a disability. Winsett read the note, her lips pressed together, the expression of a woman who had been corrected and did not enjoy the experience. No one is suggesting your disability is... Vivian was already writing. You just did. You described my silence as part of a suspicious pattern. My silence is not a pattern. It is a medical condition. The distinction matters. I expect it to be reflected in your report. The room temperature dropped, not physically, but in the space between two women who understood power and were now measuring each other's capacity to wield it. Winsett was accustomed to intimidating suspects through institutional authority. Vivian was accustomed to something else entirely, a form of authority that Winsett did not yet know existed, could not yet imagine, and would not believe until presented with documentation that made denial impossible. Winsett stood. The chair did not scrape. She lifted it backward with the controlled precision of someone who wanted Vivian to know that every movement in this room was intentional. I'll check on that interpreter for you, she said, the promise as hollow as the compliance sign at the Magnolia Grill. She left. The door closed. The lock engaged. Vivian sat in the silence that kept growing deeper, and she added Winsett to the catalog. Lieutenant Sheila Winsett, Detective Bureau Commander. Entered at 12:15 a.m. No interpreter. No Miranda. Attempted to characterize disability as suspicious behavior. Promised interpreter request. No documentation of promise provided. The next person through the door was not a detective. It was Officer Fenn, carrying a clipboard and a purpose that radiated from her posture like heat from asphalt. 1:17 a.m. Vivian had been tracking time by counting the fluorescent flicker cycles overhead. Each cycle lasted approximately 3 seconds, which was imprecise but sufficient for a mind that had spent decades converting visual information into temporal data. Fenn set the clipboard on the table. On it was a form. A D. A accommodation request. Shelby County Sheriff's Office. Form SC-AD. A-7. The same form Vivian had seen on the bulletin board in the corridor. Someone, Fenn or another officer, had pulled a copy from the rack and brought it here. Vivian's pulse changed. Not from hope, from strategy. This form was documentation. Official documentation. A paper trail that would prove she had requested accommodation and that the department had received the request. She picked up the pen Winsett had left and began filling it out, with the meticulous care of someone who understood that forms were architecture and architecture was power. Name of individual requesting accommodation. Vivian R. Oakes, nature of disability, congenital deafness and mutism, bilateral sensorineural hearing loss, unable to produce speech. Type of accommodation requested, qualified ASL interpreter for all communication during detention, questioning, and legal proceedings. Date. She wrote today's date. Time, 1:19 a.m. Signature. She signed with the deliberate clarity of someone who wanted her name to be unmistakable on every copy this form would ever produce. She held the completed form out to Fenn. Fenn took it, looked at it, read it with the unhurried attention of someone who already knew what she was going to do with it. Then she tore it in half. The sound was small. Paper is not a dramatic material, but in the silence of that interrogation room at 1:19 in the morning, with a woman who had no voice watching her only formal request for accommodation destroyed in front of her eyes, the sound filled every corner of the space like a verdict. Fenn dropped the halves in the wastebasket, the same wastebasket that held Vivian's crumpled notes from Kellum's interrogation, a wastebasket becoming an archive of destroyed rights. "Interpreter's been requested," Fenn said, the lie so casual it barely registered as speech. "Should be here in the morning. Try to get some sleep." She left. The door closed. The lock engaged. Vivian stared at the wastebasket, at the torn paper visible above the rim, at the evidence of what had just happened, evidence that was now evidence of something else entirely, not just a denied accommodation, a destroyed official document, Form SC-A-DA-7, completed in full, signed, and torn in half by the officer who received it. She added it to the catalog. Officer Darla Fenn, 1:19 a.m., delivered a DA accommodation form, allowed completion, destroyed completed form by tearing in half, deposited remains in wastebasket, interrogation room B. Stated interpreter was requested, no documentation of request provided. Statement believed to be false. They returned her to cell 4B at 1:30 a.m. The men in the adjacent cells had stopped snoring. The corridor was quiet. The fluorescent light continued its endless, buzzing persistence. Vivian sat on the metal bench and performed the mental inventory that had become her ritual in captivity. Each violation numbered, each officer named, each timestamp approximated with the best precision her internal clock could provide. She was hungry. The last food she had eaten was the half-finished steak at the Magnolia Grill, approximately 5 hours ago. No one had offered food. No one had offered water since booking, where a paper cup had been placed on the counter and immediately removed before she could drink from it. She needed to use the restroom. The stainless steel toilet in the cell was exposed. No partition, no curtain, visible to anyone walking the corridor, visible to the camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling. She had been holding it since the restaurant. The physical discomfort was becoming the kind of distraction that eroded focus, which was precisely the point of designing cells where basic biological functions required public performance. She used the toilet. There was no choice. She faced the wall, her back to the corridor, and relieved herself with the mechanical efficiency of a person who had decided that dignity was not something that could be taken by architecture, only by surrender. She washed her hands in the small basin. No soap, no towel. She dried them on her slacks and returned to the bench. At 2:15 a.m., a guard she had not seen before slid a paper cup of water through the slot in the cell door. No food, no acknowledgement. Just a cup of water left on the concrete floor like an offering to an animal. She drank it, set the empty cup on the bench beside her, and continued building the case. At 3 a.m., the corridor door opened and footsteps approached, heavy, deliberate, the walk of someone who expected the world to arrange itself around his movement. Captain Hugh Stavros appeared at the cell door, backlit by the corridor lights, his silhouette filling the frame like a portrait of authority painted by someone who confused size with significance. He was late 50s, white, with a mustache that belonged to a different decade and a belly that strained the buttons of a uniform shirt he should have replaced 2 promotions ago. 3 stars on his collar. Captain's rank. The top of the local food chain in a precinct that answered to no one at 3 in the morning. "This the one?" He was talking to someone behind him. Kellum, who had materialized in the corridor with the folder he had taken from the interrogation room. Wallet theft at the Magnolia. Won't cooperate. Claims she's deaf. Kellum said, claims the way prosecutors say, alleges. With built-in doubt, pre-packaged skepticism, the linguistic equivalent of a raised eyebrow. Stavros looked at Vivian through the bars. She looked back. Two people assessing each other through metal and institutional lighting, each one measuring the other's capacity for damage. Has she been processed? Booked, fingerprinted, photographed, property inventoried. Kellum ticked the items like a shopping list. She writes notes, cites laws, wants an interpreter. At 3 a.m, Stavros's tone communicated the absurdity he perceived. For a wallet theft. She's filed, or tried to file, an ADA request. Fenn handled it. Stavros grunted, the sound of a man making a decision he would later describe as judgment and others would describe as negligence. She writes, she reads, she communicates. He counted the facts on his fingers. An interpreter is a courtesy, not a requirement. Process her for the wallet. Get her in front of a judge in the morning. Let the court sort out the disability question. He was wrong. An interpreter was not a courtesy. Under ADA Title 2 and 28 CFR Section 35.16. Law enforcement agencies were required to provide effective communication through qualified interpreters when interacting with individuals who were deaf or hard of hearing. The obligation was not discretionary. It was not dependent on the hour, the crime, or the captain's comfort level with accommodation requests. It was federal law, binding on every police department in every jurisdiction in the United States, and it had been federal law since 1990. But Stavros did not know this, or did not care, or knew, and had decided that knowledge was less convenient than ignorance. He turned from the cell door and walked back down the corridor, his footsteps receding like a verdict being carried to the next case. Kellum lingered, looked at Vivian through the bars. You heard the captain. A smirk. Oh, wait. You can't hear anything, right? He laughed. One short breath of amusement directed at a woman who could not hear it and would not have cared if she could. Get some rest. Morning's going to be a long day for you. He left. The corridor emptied. The lights stayed on. Vivian added Stavros to the catalog. Captain Hugh Stavros, 3 a.m., reviewed detention status. Classified interpreter as courtesy, not requirement. Direct quote. Authorized continued detention without ADA accommodation. Did not review property inventory. Did not question absence of Miranda delivery. Instructed processing for morning arraignment. She leaned against the concrete wall, closed her eyes. Not to sleep, to organize. The catalog was growing. The violations were accumulating. The case was building itself with every hour they held her. Every accommodation they denied, every form they destroyed, every right they violated while believing they were simply doing their jobs. They did not know who she was. They did not know what she did for a living. They did not know that the woman they were treating as a petty theft suspect had spent 11 years making decisions that altered the trajectories of lives, that her signature carried the weight of federal authority, that her judgments were binding on every law enforcement officer in the Western District of Tennessee. They would find out. But not yet. Not tonight. Tonight, she was a woman in a cell, without a voice, without a phone, without a pen, surrounded by people who had decided her silence meant guilt, and her disability meant inconvenience. She pressed her palms flat against the concrete wall behind her. Cool, solid, permanent, like the law itself, indifferent to the people who violated it, patient with the people who enforced it, and absolute in its eventual application. She sat in the silence, and she waited. Shift change happened at 6 a.m. Vivian knew because the quality of the fluorescent light shifted, not the light itself, which was relentless and unchanging, but the light in the corridor beyond her cell, where overhead fixtures on separate circuits activated with the arrival of day shift personnel. Shadows moved differently. The air pressure changed as doors opened and closed with increased frequency. Bodies passed her cell with purposeful energy rather than the shuffling indifference of the night crew. She had not slept, not from inability, from choice. Sleep was surrender. Sleep was closing the archive, pausing the documentation, stepping away from the evidence-gathering process that was the only productive activity available to her. She had rested instead, eyes closed, breathing regulated, muscles deliberately relaxed, in the controlled way that someone trained in sustained attention rests, restoring the body without releasing the mind. At 6:22 a.m., a new officer appeared at her cell door. The nameplate read, Platt. Officer Corinne Platt, white, early 30s, with the scrubbed alertness of someone who had arrived early for her shift and the particular expression of a person who was reading a file and not liking what she found. She carried a clipboard, different from Fenn's, and was flipping through pages with the focused attention of someone looking for something that should have been there and was not. She looked up from the clipboard, looked at Vivian, looked back at the clipboard. "Has anyone provided you with an interpreter?" The question was directed at Vivian, but spoken aloud, which was itself a problem. A hearing question directed at a deaf woman, the same miscommunication loop that had been cycling since 8:53 the previous evening. Vivian signed, no interpreter, 14 hours, no food, 1 cup of water, no Miranda in accessible format, no access to counsel. Platt watched the signing. She did not understand ASL. That much was clear from her expression. But she understood something else. She understood the length of the signing, the deliberateness of the hand movements, the eye contact that held an intensity incompatible with the intake form's description of an uncooperative suspect. She understood that this woman was communicating a great deal of information and that none of it was being received. She stepped away from the cell door. Returned 3 minutes later with a pen and a legal pad, not the one Kellum had confiscated, a fresh one from the supply closet. "Can you write for me?" Platt said, sliding the pad through the food slot. "I need to understand your situation." Vivian took the pad, and she wrote. She wrote for 7 minutes without stopping. Not a statement, a chronology. Every event, every officer, every request, every denial, every violation, organized by timestamp and officer name, cross-referenced with badge numbers where known and physical descriptions where badge numbers had not been visible. She wrote the way a court reporter records proceedings, not editorializing, not emotionalizing, just documenting with the forensic precision of someone who understood that facts, arranged correctly, were more devastating than any argument. Platt read the document. Her face changed. Not dramatically, she was too professional for dramatic reactions, but the muscles around her eyes tightened and her breathing shifted from automatic to conscious. The way breathing shifts when the body registers a threat the mind has not yet fully processed. "You're saying no one has provided an interpreter since 8:53 last night?" Vivian wrote, "Correct. I have requested an interpreter 11 times, 5 verbally through ASL, 4 in writing, 1 on an official ADA accommodation form that was torn in half by Officer Fenn and discarded in the wastebasket in Interrogation Room B, and once through this document. 0 interpreters have been provided." Platt read the line about the torn form twice, her jaw set. "The ADA form. You completed it, officially, and it was destroyed." Vivian wrote, "Yes. Form SC-ADA-7. Completed at approximately 1:19 a.m. Torn in half by Officer Fenn, badge number 4721. Remains may still be in the wastebasket in Interrogation Room B." Platt stood very still. The kind of stillness that precedes action, not paralysis, but calculation. The rapid internal mathematics of a person weighing institutional loyalty against legal obligation and finding the balance tipping in a direction she had not expected when she started her shift. She brought Vivian water. Not a paper cup slid through a slot. a bottle of water from the break room, handed through the cell door with the brief, unmistakable contact of one person acknowledging another person's humanity, and a granola bar, and a banana. Small things. Enormous things. "Ma'am," Platt said, and then corrected herself. "Ms. Oakes." The correction was small. The correction was everything. The shift from generic address to specific name, from institutional processing to individual recognition, from a system that had spent 14 hours refusing to see this woman to an officer who was suddenly, uncomfortably, seeing her very clearly. Vivian noted the correction, filed it. It was the first time since the Magnolia Grill that anyone in this system had used her name with respect rather than as a weapon or a label. Platt excused herself, walked down the corridor, turned the corner, disappeared from Vivian's line of sight. And then, faintly, through the vibrations in the concrete wall, Vivian pressed her palm against. She felt rather than heard a door open and close. Felt the rhythm of footsteps moving away, then stopping. Felt the absence of sound that meant someone was standing still, speaking, quietly, having a conversation they did not want overheard. Platt was making a phone call. Vivian could not hear it, could not know who was on the other end, could not guess what Platt had found in the system when she ran Vivian's name through databases that her night shift colleagues had apparently not bothered to access. But the call was being made, and the world outside this cell was beginning to move. This story is about to take a turn that no one in that precinct saw coming. And when it does, you'll understand why every second of those 14 hours mattered. Stay with this. You do not want to miss what happens next. While Platt was away, the machinery of institutional self-protection was already grinding into motion. In the detective bureau, 30 feet from Vivian's cell, through 2 locked doors and a corridor lined with filing cabinets that contained decades of reports no one would ever read, Kellum was preparing for what he called round 2. He had not slept either, but for different reasons. His reasons involved conviction, the unshakable certainty that Vivian Oakes was guilty and that her silence was merely the most sophisticated version of the most common defense, refusing to cooperate until cooperation became unavoidable. He had broken silent suspects before. He would break this one. What he did not know, what no one in the precinct knew except a recently awakened duty officer at the Shelby County IT department whose phone had buzzed at 5:47 a.m. with an automated alert from the bodycam server, was that his bodycam unit, logged in the incident report as equipment malfunction, video inoperative, audio unavailable, was in fact functioning in passive audio record mode. The video had been manually disabled, as Kellum's incident report stated. But the audio backup, a system designed to prevent exactly this kind of selective documentation, had continued recording through its own power source, independent of the video feed, capturing every word spoken within 6 feet of the unit from the moment Kellum entered interrogation room B until the moment he exited and placed the bodycam in his locker without powering it down. 14 hours of audio, every threat, every insult, every crumpled piece of paper, every silence that lasted longer than patience and shorter than forever. The IT duty officer listened to the first 4 minutes of the recording, paused it, and made 2 phone calls. The first was to his supervisor. The second was to a number he had never called before, a number printed on a laminated card taped to the inside of his desk drawer, labeled Judicial Integrity Hotline, for emergency use only. He did not know why a wallet theft suspect's detention would require calling a Judicial Integrity Hotline. He only knew that when he had cross-referenced the name Vivian R. Oakes against federal databases, something the arresting officers had apparently not done, something that would have taken 30 seconds and changed the entire trajectory of this encounter, the screen had returned a result that made his hands stop moving on the keyboard, a result that included a title that should have been known to every law enforcement officer in the Western District of Tennessee, a title that, once spoken aloud, would detonate the careful fiction that Kellum, Winsett, Trask, Fenn, and Stavros had spent 14 hours constructing, the fiction that this was a simple wallet theft investigation that this woman's silence was suspicious, that her disability was an act, that her rights were optional, and that none of it would ever matter because she was nobody. She was not nobody. And the phone calls were already being made. Back in cell 4B, Vivian ate the granola bar slowly, breaking it into 4 pieces and chewing each one with deliberate patience. The banana she peeled and consumed in 6 bites. The water she drank in 3 long swallows, rationing against the possibility that it might be hours before anyone offered more. Platt returned. Her face had changed again. Not the tightening of alarm, but the careful neutrality of someone who has learned something they cannot yet act on and must hold in the space between knowledge and disclosure. Ms. Oakes? The name again, used with that specific, careful respect. Detective Kellum will want to speak with you again this morning. I want to make sure you understand that you have the right to request an attorney before any further questioning. Vivian wrote, I have requested counsel repeatedly. No access has been provided. I am requesting counsel now in writing to you, please. Document this request and provide access to a phone or other communication method so I can contact an attorney. Platt read the note, nodded. I'll document this. And Ms. Oakes, she paused, selecting her words with the precision of someone who knew they might be quoted later. I want you to know that your request for an interpreter has been logged, by me, in the system, time-stamped. Another pause. It's in the system now. The emphasis on now was barely detectable, a microsecond of additional pressure on the word, the slightest tightening of the vowel. But Vivian caught it. She caught everything. And what Platt was saying, beneath the professional surface of her words, was, it was not in the system before. Your previous requests were not documented, but this one is, and it cannot be undocumented. Vivian wrote, thank you. 2 words. But they carried weight that neither woman could speak aloud. The weight of one person inside a system designed to silence, choosing to be the first crack in the wall. In the detective bureau, Kellum was reviewing Fenn's incident report from the previous night. The report was 3 pages. The report was a work of fiction. Subject was verbally advised of her rights at the scene, the report stated, and this was false. Vivian had not been advised of any rights at the scene because no one had communicated with her in any modality she could access. Subject declined to respond to verbal commands, the report stated, and this was not false but was misleadingly incomplete. She had not declined to respond. She had been physically incapable of verbal response, a distinction that Fenn had been informed of at first contact and had chosen to omit. Subject's personal electronics. No phone recovered at scene, the report stated, and this was a lie. Vivian's phone had been confiscated by Fenn at 8:55 p.m. at table 23 of the Magnolia Grill, in front of Officer Holbrook, in front of the restaurant's security cameras, and in front of every diner within 15 feet who had watched a police officer take a phone from a woman's hands while she was trying to explain that she could not speak. The phone was not in evidence. It was not in the property inventory. It was, presumably, still in Fenn's jacket pocket, or wherever officers kept things they needed to disappear. Kellum did not question the report. Kellum did not question reports. Reports were the institutional record, the official version, the story that would stand in courtrooms and depositions and internal affairs inquiries unless someone produced evidence that contradicted them. And evidence required documentation, and documentation required tools, and tools were exactly what they had taken from the woman in cell 4B. Her phone, her pen, her paper, her voice, the voice she had never had, the voice that did not exist, the voice whose absence they were using as evidence of guilt, rather than evidence of disability. But they had missed something. They had missed the body cam. They had missed the restaurant's security cameras. They had missed the IT system's automatic audio backup. They had missed the federal databases that Platt had apparently checked, and they had not. And they had missed the most dangerous thing of all, the mind of a woman who had spent decades building cases, evaluating evidence, identifying procedural violations, and rendering judgments that could not be appealed. They had missed the judge. At 7:10 a.m., Vivian heard, felt, through the vibrations in the wall and floor, commotion in the corridor. Multiple footsteps. Voices raised, then lowered, then raised again. The particular frequency of institutional panic, not the panic of emergency, but the panic of people who have realized they have made a mistake too large to quietly correct and too documented to successfully deny. She pressed her palm to the wall, felt the vibrations change. Someone was walking toward her cell. Not one person. 3, maybe 4. The footsteps were overlapping, urgent. The sound of authority arriving faster than the people who possessed it wanted to appear. She sat up straighter, smoothed her blazer, wrinkled from 14 hours on a metal bench, stained with something she could not identify, torn slightly at the collar where the handcuffs had caught the fabric during the arrest. She ran her fingers through her hair, restoring what order she could. She set her hands on her knees, palms down, the posture of a woman who was not preparing to be rescued, but preparing to preside. And then she waited. Because the footsteps were coming, and with them, the end of everything. The people in this building thought they knew, and the beginning of everything they were about to learn. End of Part 1. In Part 2, the cell door opens, and the woman who has not spoken a word in 14 hours will finally be heard. But not in the way anyone expects, not through her voice, through her title. The detective who spent the night threatening her will discover that the silent woman in cell 4B holds a lifetime appointment from the President of the United States, that her signature has sent people to federal prison, that her courtroom is 30 minutes from this precinct, and that every word he said, every form he crumpled, every right he denied, all of it was recorded. The reckoning is not coming. It is here. At 6:40 a.m., 14 hours and 47 minutes after Vivian's arrival, the corridor door banged open. Kellum. He had changed shirts, but not his expression. The fresh collar was still creased from the package. The contempt was well worn. He carried a styrofoam cup of coffee in one hand and a fresh legal pad in the other. Behind him, Fen followed with the ring of cell keys already in her hand. The keys she should not have possessed, since cell access during shift transitions was supposed to be controlled by the booking sergeant, not patrol officers whose involvement in the case had ended at intake. The cell door opened. Kellum entered the space the way weather enters an attic, filling it completely, leaving no room for anything else. He set the coffee on the bench beside Vivian, not offered, placed, the way you place a prop on a stage before a scene begins. Last chance. His voice was hoarse from the night, but his certainty was freshly caffeinated. The DA reviews new cases at 8. Right now, you're a wallet theft. Write a statement, and you're out before the courthouse opens. Stay silent, and I file enhanced charges. Obstruction, resisting, failure to identify. Your choice. He dropped the legal pad in her lap. Not beside her, in her lap, the cardboard backing striking her thighs with enough force to make the gesture unmistakable. Not an offer. A demand delivered through physical contact that was technically permissible and practically aggressive. Vivian lifted the pad from her lap and set it on the bench beside her. She did not write. She did not sign. She met Kellum's eyes and held them with the unblinking patience of a woman who had decided, sometime around 4 a.m., that further communication with this man would produce no results worth the effort of producing them. The refusal detonated something in Kellum that 14 hours of frustration had been building toward. His hand shot out, not to strike, but to grab. His fingers closed around Vivian's upper arm, above the elbow, pulling her to standing with a force that lifted her half off the bench before her feet caught the floor. "Stand up when I'm talking to you." Vivian's feet found the concrete. She stood. Her arm remained in his. Grip. His fingers white-knuckled around the blazer fabric, the pressure hard enough to leave bruises that would be photographed and catalogued as Exhibit 14 in the case file that was already being assembled by people Kellum did not yet know existed. Fen stood in the doorway, watching, not intervening, not documenting, just watching, the way bystanders watch, present but uninvolved, visible but useless, the particular complicity of witnesses who choose not to witness. Vivian did not pull away, did not struggle, did not give him the resistance that would justify the force. She stood in his grip and looked at his hand on her arm, then looked at his face, then looked at the camera in the corridor ceiling beyond the open cell door. The camera whose red light was blinking, which meant it was recording, which meant his hand on her arm was being documented in a format more permanent than memory and more persuasive than testimony. She raised her free hand, the left one, and signed a single word, slowly, with the deliberate emphasis of someone making a statement for the record. Kellum did not understand the sign. He would learn later, in the IA hearing, that the word was documented. His grip loosened, not from understanding, from the sudden, irrational discomfort of a man who sensed that this interaction was being observed in ways he could not fully control. He released her arm, stepped back. The coffee cup on the bench tipped from the motion, spilling lukewarm, liquid across the metal surface and dripping onto the floor in a small brown pool that no one would clean up for hours. "Fine." The word carried the weight of a man closing a door he intended to nail shut. "You want to play this game? We'll play. I'm adding resisting to the charge sheet. You just pulled away from an officer." She had not pulled away. She had stood motionless while he grabbed her and released her. The body cam in the corridor had captured the entire interaction. The narrative Kellum was constructing, the one where she resisted, the one where his use of force was justified, the one where her silence was obstruction, would not survive the video. But Kellum did not know that yet. Kellum still believed in a world where his version of events was the only version that mattered. He left the cell. Fenn locked the door behind him. The corridor emptied. The spilled coffee continued dripping onto the concrete, each drop marking time in a rhythm Vivian could feel through the soles of her shoes, but could not hear. She sat back down, rubbed her arm where his fingers had been. The fabric of her blazer was warm from the pressure of his grip, a small physical detail that would fade in minutes, but that she catalogued with the same precision she catalogued everything else. Left upper arm, approximately 6:42 a.m. Duration of grip, 8 to 10 seconds. Sufficient force to lift from seated position. Officer Fenn present as witness. Corridor camera recording. She had 15 minutes. She did not know it was 15 minutes. She did not know that while Kellum was grabbing her arm and threatening enhanced charges, 3 phone calls were converging on this precinct from 3 different directions. Colvin from the court, the IT duty officer from the county server room, and a deputy U.S. Marshal from the federal building 6 blocks south, and that the convergence would arrive in the form of footsteps that were already echoing in the parking lot outside. In the booking area, Fenn was not idle. She sat at a terminal near the property desk, her back to the corridor, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the particular urgency of someone editing a record they hoped no one would compare to the original. The property inventory form. The one Vivian had refused to sign. The one that listed 7 items instead of 8. Fenn was not adding the phone. That would create a paper trail she could not control. She was modifying the narrative field at the bottom of the form, the free text box where officers could add context to the inventory. Original text. Subject refused to sign. Cited incomplete inventory. Modified text. Subject refused to sign. Became agitated during inventory process. No discrepancies noted. The edit was small. The edit was everything. The difference between a detainee who identified a specific problem with the documentation and a detainee who was simply difficult. The difference between a legitimate complaint and behavioral disruption. The difference between an officer who omitted a phone and an officer whose inventory was complete. She saved the file. The timestamp updated to 6:45 a.m. She did not know that the county's document management system maintained version histories, a feature implemented 3 years ago after a different evidence tampering scandal that had resulted in different reforms that had been different kinds of insufficient. The original text was preserved in the system's backup layer, accessible to anyone with administrative credentials and a reason to look. The Marshal's Service forensics team would find it within the hour. The footsteps arrived in formation, not the casual stagger of officers drifting between tasks, not the heavy solitary tread of Kellum or Stavros making rounds. This was coordinated movement, 3 sets of shoes striking the corridor floor with the synchronized precision of people who had walked into buildings together before and knew exactly how the next 60 seconds would unfold. The first person Vivian saw was a woman. Late 50s, black, silver locks pulled back from a face that radiated controlled fury. The kind of fury that was not performed but governed, held at a calibrated temperature that could sustain pressure for hours without boiling over. She wore a charcoal suit, no jewelry, and carried a leather portfolio embossed with gold lettering Vivian could not read from inside the cell. But she did not need to read it. She recognized the woman the way you recognize a colleague you have worked alongside for a decade, by posture, by carriage, by the particular gravity that certain people bring into rooms. Marguerite Colvin, Chief Clerk of the United States District Court for the Western District of Tennessee, the woman who managed the administrative machinery of federal justice in Memphis, dockets, case assignments, courtroom logistics, judicial schedules. The woman who would have noticed, around 7 a.m. this morning, that Judge Vivian Oakes had not appeared for the 8 o'clock panel at the Sixth Circuit Judicial Conference. Who would have called Vivian's phone and received no answer? Who would have called the hotel and been told Miss Oakes had not returned to her room? Who would have, because Marguerite Colvin was meticulous in ways that made other meticulous people feel careless, begun making the calls that eventually led her here? Behind Colvin, 2 men, both wearing navy windbreakers with 3 words stenciled across the back in reflective yellow, U.S. Marshal Service. They were not tactical. No helmets, no visible long guns, no battering ram energy. They were administrative, official. The embodiment of federal jurisdiction arriving at a county precinct the way a memo from headquarters arrives at a branch office, quietly, precisely, and with the understanding that compliance is not optional. The booking desk officer, a day shift sergeant Vivian had not seen before, stood up so fast his chair hit the wall behind him. "Can I help you?" The question contained approximately 0 authority and 100% alarm. Colvin did not slow down. She set her portfolio on the booking counter, opened it, and produced a document. Heavy paper, embossed seal, the kind of document that made bureaucratic processes accelerate or halt depending on which direction the seal was facing. "I am Marguerite Colvin, Chief Clerk of the United States District Court, Western District of Tennessee." She spoke with the cadence of someone who had introduced herself this way 10,000 times and intended the words to land with the same weight on the 10,001st. "This is an order of the United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit, signed by Chief Judge Harlan Westbrook at 6:47 this morning. It directs the immediate release of the Honorable Vivian R. Oakes, United States District Judge, currently being held in this facility. It further directs the preservation of all records, recordings, digital files, body cam footage, intake documentation, and communications related to her detention. Failure to comply constitutes contempt of a federal court order, punishable under Title 18, United States Code, Section 401. The booking sergeant's mouth opened, closed, opened again. No sound emerged. He looked like a man who had been handed a grenade and told it was a gift. "I need a supervisor," he finally managed. "You need to open that cell," Colvin said, her voice dropping half a register. "Now. Supervisory approval is not required for compliance with a federal court order. The order is the approval." One of the marshals, the taller one, with a jaw that appeared to have been engineered for silence, stepped to the counter and placed his credentials beside Colvin's portfolio. Deputy U.S. Marshal credentials. The badge caught the overhead light and threw a small reflection onto the sergeant's shirt, right above his heart. "Deputy Marshal Rowan. This is Deputy Marshal Cisneros." His voice was flat, uninflected, the voice of a man who had been trained to deliver statements that were not invitations for discussion. We are here to execute the court's order. If the subject of the order is not released within the next 5 minutes, we will contact the Marshal Service Duty Supervisor for authorization to conduct a custodial extraction. We would prefer not to escalate." The word "prefer" did a remarkable amount of work in that sentence. The booking sergeant reached for his radio. The call went to dispatch, who routed it to the shift commander, who, 3 minutes and 40 seconds later, was standing in the booking area with his shirt half untucked and coffee on his breath, reading the court order with the expression of a man watching his career dissolve in real time. Behind the shift commander, appearing in the corridor like actors who had missed their entrance cue, came Kellum and Winsett. They had been in the detective bureau when the radio call went out. Federal personnel at booking requesting release of detainee Oakes, and had come to investigate with the reflexive urgency of people whose names appeared in reports that might suddenly become relevant. Kellum saw the marshals, saw Colvin, saw the court order in the shift commander's hands. His face performed a series of rapid calculations, confusion giving way to irritation, irritation to concern, concern to the first cold tremor of something he would later deny feeling, but that everyone in the room could see: fear. "What's going on?" Kellum directed the question at the shift commander, not at Colvin or the marshals. The instinct of a man who sought familiar authority when unfamiliar authority arrived. The shift commander handed him the court order without a word. Kellum read it, read the first paragraph, where the caption read, "In re, Oakes." Read the second paragraph, where the words, "The Honorable Vivian R. Oakes, United States District Judge," appeared in a typeface that seemed to grow larger with each reading. Read the third paragraph, where the preservation directive listed body cam footage, interrogation recordings, intake documentation, property inventories, and all internal communications as items that now belong to the federal court system and could not be altered, deleted, or destroyed. The blood left his face in a sequence. Forehead first, then cheeks, then the space around his mouth, where his contemptuous smile had lived for 14 hours. His jaw loosened. His grip on the paper tightened until the edges crumpled in his fists. "Judge?" The word came out fractured. That can't... She never said anything." Colvin turned to him. Her gaze was not hostile. It was worse than hostile. It was diagnostic. The look of a person examining a specimen that has confirmed a hypothesis. "She couldn't say anything, Detective." Colvin's voice carried the quiet devastation of a truth so obvious it should never have required stating. "She is mute. She has been mute since birth. She communicated that fact to your officers at first contact. She requested an interpreter 11 times. She completed an official ADA accommodation form that was destroyed in front of her. She could not speak. That was not a choice. That was not a tactic. That was a disability. And you spent 14 hours treating it as evidence of guilt." Kellum's mouth worked. Words assembled behind his teeth and fell apart before they could become sentences. He looked at Winsett, who was reading the court order over his shoulder, her face a mask of professional neutrality that was cracking at the edges like paint on a wall exposed to sudden heat. "Nobody told me she was a judge." Kellum's voice was smaller now, the voice of a man searching for a defense and finding only descriptions of what he had done. "She didn't. There was nothing in the system." "Because no one checked the system," Colvin said. "A 30-second query of federal databases would have returned her judicial appointment records. Her photograph is on the court's public website. Her name is listed in every federal judiciary directory published in the last 11 years. You held a sitting United States District Judge for 14 hours, without counsel, without accommodation, and without the basic dignity your own department's posted policies require." She paused. "I am going to ask you one more time to open that cell." The shift commander nodded to the booking sergeant. The sergeant reached for the keys. The walk from the booking desk to cell 4B was 67 steps. Vivian had counted them during her transit the night before. Now she felt them approaching through the vibrations in the floor, the heavy tread of the shift commander, the measured steps of the marshals, the sharp click of Colvin's heels against linoleum that had not been mopped since the night shift ended. The cell door opened. Not the smooth mechanical slide of a well-maintained locking system, but the resistant scrape of metal that had been closing on people for decades and had developed the grudging stubbornness of a mechanism that resented being reversed. Vivian stood. She did not rush, did not lunge for the door, did not perform the relief that movies required of liberated prisoners. She stood with the controlled deliberation of a woman who had spent 14 hours preparing for this moment and intended to execute it with precision. Colvin stepped into the doorway. Their eyes met. Colvin's composure, the governance that had held her fury at operating temperature since she had learned where Vivian was, shifted for exactly 1 second. The shift was private, visible only to Vivian, a micro-expression that communicated 12 years of professional respect and approximately 36 hours of personal terror compressed into a single look. Then the composure returned. Colvin extended her hand and produced a pen, a black Mont Blanc, Vivian's own pen, retrieved from Colvin's office where she had been keeping it, and a small leather-bound notebook. Communication tools. The first proper communication tools anyone had offered Vivian since 8:53 the previous evening. Vivian took them, wrote 3 words. "Thank you, Marguerite." Colvin nodded. Professional. Brisk. The acknowledgement of a colleague, not a rescuer. Then she stepped aside so the marshals could flank Vivian for the walkout. They moved through the corridor, past the holding cells, past the interrogation rooms, both doors now open, both rooms empty, as if the building itself was exhaling its secrets. Past the bulletin board with the ADA accommodation form card still pinned in the lower right corner, still partially obscured by the softball tournament flyer that someone should have taken down 3 weeks ago. Into the booking area, where Kellum stood. He was positioned beside the counter, his body angled as if he could not decide whether to stand at attention or retreat. The manila folder, Vivian's folder, the one containing Fenn's fictional incident report, and the grainy security photo labeled Suspect, Oakes, V, was in his hand, held loosely, the way a person holds something they no longer want but cannot figure out where to put down. Vivian stopped walking. The marshals stopped beside her. Colvin stood 2 steps behind. The shift commander froze mid-motion near the front desk. Even the booking sergeant, who had been typing something on his computer with the desperate energy of a man trying to look busy, went still. Vivian looked at Kellum. Not up at him. He was taller, but she had never needed height to command a room. She looked at him, the way she looked at defendants in her courtroom when she was about to deliver a ruling they would not enjoy. The look that contained no malice and no mercy, just the facts, just the law, just the weight of everything he had done and everything that would follow. Then she raised her hands and signed. The movements were slow, precise, deliberate. Not the rapid conversational signing she used with friends and colleagues, but the formal, elevated signing she used in legal contexts, each gesture given its full space and duration, so that every person watching would understand that these movements carried the gravity of language, even if they could not decode the specific meaning. Colvin translated. Her voice was steady, calibrated, projecting into the booking area with the practiced clarity of a woman who had read judicial opinions into the record for 3 decades. Judge Oakes says, "Every minute of my detention has been documented. Every officer's name has been recorded. Every violation of my constitutional rights has been catalogued with the applicable federal statute. You will be hearing from the Department of Justice." The silence that followed was not Vivian's silence, not the silence of disability, not the silence of choice, not the silence of a woman who could not speak. It was the silence of an institution, realizing that the person it had spent 14 hours trying to silence was the one person in the building with the authority to hold it accountable. Kellum's hand opened. The folder slid from his fingers. Papers scattered across the floor. The intake form, the incident report, the security photo, the property inventory with its missing phone entry. Each one landing face up, visible, readable, suddenly and permanently evidence. No one picked them up. The marshals escorted Vivian through the front door, into daylight that hit her eyes with the physical force of 14 hours of fluorescent deprivation. She blinked, adjusted, straightened her torn blazer, and walked toward the black sedan waiting at the curb with the measured stride of a woman who had never lost her authority, only waited for the institution to catch up with the fact that it existed. Every person in that precinct is now facing the consequences of what they did to a woman they refused to hear. If this story has you holding your breath, share it with someone who needs to see it, because the reckoning is far from over. The investigation began before Vivian's sedan had left the precinct parking lot. Not the internal investigation, that would come later, reluctantly, dragged into existence by federal pressure and media scrutiny. The first investigation was federal, initiated by the Judicial Integrity Unit of the U.S. Marshals Service within 40 minutes of Vivian's release, operating under a mandate so specific it left no room for the institutional foot-dragging that typically characterized police. Accountability proceedings. Deputy Marshal Rowan served the preservation order on Precinct South's evidence custodian at 7:32 a.m., 11 minutes after Vivian walked out the front door. The order covered body cam footage from all officers involved in the arrest, detention, and interrogation of Vivian Oakes, internal email communications referencing the case number, radio dispatch logs, booking records, property inventory documents, cell block access logs, and, critically, the contents of the wastebaskets in Interrogation Room B and the booking area. The wastebaskets had not been emptied. The night janitor's shift had ended at 5 a.m., and the morning custodial crew did not begin their rounds until 8. In the wastebasket beside Kellum's chair in Interrogation Room B, federal investigators recovered 7 items: 4 crumpled sheets of yellow legal paper containing Vivian's handwritten requests for an interpreter, a crumpled sheet containing her written denial of theft and assertion of innocence, and, at the bottom, beneath a coffee cup and 2 energy bar wrappers, 2 halves of a completed ADA accommodation request form, SC-ADA-7, signed by Vivian R. Oakes at approximately 1:19 a.m., torn through the center in a clean horizontal line consistent with deliberate destruction. The form halves were photographed, cataloged, placed in evidence bags, and assigned case evidence number USMS-WD-TN-2004-0412-EX-7A and 7B. The body cam footage was recovered from the precinct's server by a Marshals Service digital forensics specialist who arrived at 8:15 a.m. and had full access to the system by 8:23. Kellum's unit, logged in the incident report as equipment malfunction, video inoperative, audio unavailable, yielded 14 hours and 11 minutes of continuous audio recording from its backup circuit. The video feed had been manually disabled at 10:02 p.m., consistent with the detective switching off the camera's visual recording function while leaving the unit powered on. The audio backup system, designed specifically to prevent selective documentation, had captured every sound in its range from that moment forward. Body cam audio recovered unit designation KC-6138. Timestamp 10:07 p.m. Location: Interrogation Room B, Precinct South. Detective Bryce Kellum, badge number 6138. The recording begins mid-sentence. Been doing this 15 years. They all have a tell. The deaf ones, the mute ones, the ones who suddenly can't speak English when you put them in a chair. Watch. Sound of palm striking metal surface. See? Nothing. Not even a flinch. That's not deaf. That's trained. She's rehearsed this. Probably ran the same play at 3 other restaurants this month. Pause. Sound of chair legs on concrete. I'll break it. Give me an hour. No verbal response from subject documented at any point during the recording. The audio continued for 14 hours, every interrogation session, every demand for speech from a woman who could not speak, every crumpled paper, every slammed door, Every silence that Kellum interpreted as defiance and history would interpret as endurance. The second piece of evidence recovered was electronic. Fenn's patrol vehicle dashcam had captured the arrest at the Magnolia Grill from a distance of approximately 40 feet. The footage showed Vivian holding her phone toward Fenn, the phone displaying text, and Fenn removing the phone from Vivian's hand without verbal warning or documentation. The phone was visible in Fenn's left hand as she escorted Vivian to the patrol car. It was visible entering Fenn's left jacket pocket at 8:59 p.m., and it was absent from the property inventory completed by Sergeant Trask at 9:41 p.m. The phone was recovered from Fenn's personal locker at Precinct South at 9:05 a.m., still powered down, still in the black case Vivian had described. It was logged as evidence item USMS-WD-TN-205-0412-EX-12. Internal email recovered from Shelby County Sheriff's Office server. Sent, 11:40 p.m. From Sergeant Nolan Trask, Booking Desk, Precinct South, to Officer Darla Fenn. Subject, Property Inventory Update. Body, clean up the inventory. She doesn't need a phone making problems for us. I'll adjust the intake form. Reply, 11:51 p.m. From Fenn, to Trask. Subject, RE. Property Inventory Update. Body, done. Removed from log. Filed as no personal electronics recovered at scene. Both emails were recovered by the Marshals Service forensics team from the server's backup partition. They had not been deleted. They had not been encrypted. They existed in plain text on a county server maintained with taxpayer funds, documenting the deliberate falsification of a property inventory and the concealment of a confiscated communication device from a disabled detainee who had been using that device as her primary means of communication. The emails were assigned evidence numbers and forwarded to the FBI's Civil Rights Division field office in Memphis within the hour. 3 months passed. 91 days during which the machinery of accountability ground forward with the maddening necessary slowness that distinguished justice from vengeance. Vivian returned to her bench. She presided over cases. She issued rulings. She conducted hearings with the same measured precision she had always brought to the work, assisted by the 2 ASL interpreters who flanked her bench during every proceeding, a visible, daily reminder of the accommodation she had been denied and of the system she served despite its failures. She did not speak publicly about the detention. Her attorney, Julia Wren, a civil rights litigator from Nashville whom Vivian had retained within hours of her release, handled all media inquiries with a statement that read, "Judge Oaks is cooperating fully with the federal investigation and has no further comment at this time." The restraint was strategic. Vivian's power was not in her voice, which she did not possess. It was in her patience, which was limitless. The internal affairs investigation at the Shelby County Sheriff's Office proceeded along 2 parallel tracks. The administrative track, disciplinary review of the 5 officers involved, was handled by the IA commander, Captain Lorraine Buckner, with oversight from a civilian review panel member and a police union representative. The criminal track, potential federal charges under 18 U.S.C. Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law, and 18 U.S.C. Section 1519, destruction and falsification of records in a federal investigation, was handled by the FBI Field Office and the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Western District of Tennessee. Vivian recused herself from both tracks. She had no choice. 28 U.S.C. Section 455 required a judge to recuse when she was a victim, a witness, or personally involved in the facts at issue. Her recusal was automatic, absolute, and, for a woman who had spent 11 years making decisions from the bench, profoundly frustrating. She could build the case. She could not adjudicate it. She could document every violation. She could not impose consequences. The consequences would come from others, and they would come slowly, partially, and incompletely, because that was how systems held themselves accountable, when they held themselves accountable at all. The IA hearing convened on a Tuesday in January, 3 months and 6 days after the detention. The hearing room, a windowless conference space on the 4th floor of the Shelby County Justice Center, was arranged with a long table for the panel, a witness chair, a defense table for the officers' union representatives, and 40 folding chairs for observers, all of which were occupied. Captain Buckner presided. Beside her sat Marcus Reeves, the civilian oversight member, a retired school principal with a permanent expression of controlled displeasure, and Sergeant-at-Arms Dale Croft, the union representative who understood his role was to ensure procedural fairness for the accused officers, and who performed that role with the visible discomfort of a man who had reviewed the body cam audio and wished he had not. The evidence was presented chronologically. Not by Vivian. She was not called to testify at the IA hearing, which was an administrative proceeding, not a trial. Instead, the IA investigating officer, Detective Rachel Ortiz, walked the panel through the timeline using documents, recordings, and exhibits that had been assembled into a 300-page case file over the preceding 12 weeks. Exhibit 1, Body Cam Audio, Unit KC-6138, assigned to Detective Bryce Kellum. Timestamp 10:07 p.m. The recording played through desktop speakers positioned at the center of the panel's table. The audio quality was imperfect. Background hiss, the occasional pop of the unit shifting against Kellum's shirt. But the words were clear, devastatingly, unmistakably clear. She's not deaf. She's playing games. I've been doing this 15 years. They all have a tell. Watch. Sound of palm striking table. See? Nothing. Not even a flinch. That's not deaf. That's trained. The room listened. Kellum, seated at the defense table with his union attorney beside him, stared at a fixed point on the wall above the panel's heads. His jaw was locked. His hands were flat on the table in front of him, the same posture he had demanded of Vivian, performed now involuntarily, the body language of a man who understood that movement would be interpreted, and interpreted badly. The recording continued. 90 minutes of selected excerpts, the most relevant segments identified by Detective Ortiz and stipulated as authentic by the defense, after forensic analysis confirmed the audio had not been altered or edited. At the 40-minute mark, the panel heard Kellum's voice say, "Silence isn't a right, sweetheart. Silence is what guilty people do when they're out of lies." The union representative closed his eyes briefly. At the 57-minute mark, "Write something useful, or don't write at all." Sound of paper tearing. "Not that." The civilian member, Reeves, removed his glasses and pressed his thumb and forefinger against the bridge of his nose. At the 73-minute mark, the recording captured the sound of a metal chair being dragged across concrete, the moment when Kellum had pulled Vivian's chair from the detective's position to the suspect's position, with her still seated in it. The audio alone communicated the violence of the motion, the shriek of metal legs, the sharp exhale that could have been surprise or pain, the silence that followed as Kellum settled into the power chair and began his interrogation from the position of authority he had physically reclaimed. Exhibit 2, Corridor Security Footage, Precinct South, Camera Designation CS-4B-CORR, Timestamp 6:41 a.m. The footage was grainy, institutional cameras optimized for coverage rather than clarity, but the events were unmistakable. Kellum entering cell 4B, his hand extending, gripping the upper arm of the seated detainee, pulling her upward with visible force, the detainee's feet leaving the floor for approximately 1 second before regaining contact with the concrete. Kellum's grip maintained for 8 seconds, the detainee's left hand rising to sign a single word. Kellum releasing, stepping back, departing. The civilian member, Reeves, leaned into his microphone. "Detective Ortiz, the detainee's medical examination following release. What did it document regarding the arm?" Ortiz consulted her file. The medical examination conducted at Methodist Le Bonheur Hospital at 9:15 a.m. on the date of release documented contusions on the left upper arm consistent with forceful gripping, 4 distinct pressure points consistent with a hand grip, Photographs taken by the examining physician are included as Exhibit 2B. Reeves studied the photographs projected onto the screen. 4 bruises arranged in the pattern of a hand, thumb on one side, 4 fingers on the other. Dark against Vivian's skin, the kind of evidence that did not require expert interpretation because human hands leave the same marks on every body they grip too hard. And this occurred during a detention for a misdemeanor wallet theft that was never charged. Correct. No charges were ever filed against Judge Oakes. The wallet was recovered in the victim's vehicle approximately 90 minutes after the arrest, having fallen between the driver's seat and the center console. The victim did not notify the precinct of the recovery until the following morning. The wallet had never been stolen. The crime had never occurred. The entire 14-hour detention, the interrogation, the intimidation, the denied accommodation, the destroyed form, the confiscated phone, the grab, the bruises, had been based on a wallet that was sitting in a car wedged between leather seats, waiting to be found by a woman who was too busy drinking wine to check her own vehicle before calling the police on a stranger. The gallery exhaled. Several observers in the folding chairs shifted in their seats. One woman in the 3rd row pressed her hand against her mouth. Exhibit 3. Testimony of Officer Corinne Platt, badge number 8316. Platt took the witness chair with the posture of someone who had prepared extensively and was still terrified. She described the morning of her shift, the intake file she reviewed, the absence of any ADA notation, the 3 written requests that should have been logged and were not, the conversation with Trask. She's faking it, she can hear fine, and her decision to check the federal database. Why did you check federal databases? Detective Ortiz asked. That's not standard procedure for a misdemeanor detention. Platt paused, chose her words. Because something was wrong. The intake file described an uncooperative suspect who refused to speak, but when I looked at her through the cell door, I didn't see someone refusing. I saw someone trying. Her hands were moving. Her eyes were tracking my lips. She was writing on her palm with her finger because they had taken her pen. That's not refusal. That's effort. And I wanted to know who was making that effort at 6 in the morning after 14 hours in a cell. And what did the federal database return? Her judicial appointment record, her photograph, her court assignment, everything that a 30-second search would have shown anyone who looked. And no one looked before you. No one looked. The words landed in the hearing room like stones dropped into still water, the ripples spreading outward, touching every officer at the defense table, every observer in the folding chairs, every corner of a system that had spent 14 hours not looking at a woman who was sitting in plain sight. Exhibit 3B, Modified Property Inventory Record. Detective Ortiz displayed 2 versions side by side on the projector, the original, recovered from the system's backup layer, and the modified version saved by Officer Fenn at 6:45 a.m. on the morning of the release. Original narrative field. Subject refused to sign. Cited incomplete inventory. Ortiz highlighted the text. Modified narrative field, saved 13 minutes before federal personnel arrived. Subject refused to sign. Became agitated during inventory process. No discrepancies noted. She turned to the panel. The modification changed the characterization of the detainee's refusal from substantive, citing a specific discrepancy, to behavioral, describing agitation. The edit was made on the morning of release, after Officer Fenn would have become aware that federal personnel were en route. Fenn's union attorney raised a procedural objection. Captain Buckner overruled it. Exhibit 4. Email chain, recovered from Shelby County server. Detective Ortiz displayed the emails on a projector screen. From Sergeant Nolan Trask to Officer Darla Fenn. Darla. Subject, property inventory update. Time sent, 11:40 p.m. Body, clean up the inventory. She doesn't need a phone making problems for us. Ortiz read the words aloud, slowly, giving each one its full weight. I'll adjust the intake form. She advanced to the reply. From Officer Fenn to Sergeant Trask. Reply sent, 11:51 p.m. Body, done. removed from log, filed as no personal electronics recovered at scene. Trask was seated 3 chairs from Kellum at the defense table, his face the color of old concrete. His union attorney had leaned away from him, a subtle but visible separation, the physical language of a representative who had calculated the cost-benefit ratio of proximity and found it wanting. Exhibit 7. A DA compliance records, Shelby County Sheriff's Office, obtained through FOIA request filed by the U.S. Attorney's Office. Detective Ortiz displayed a summary table on the projector. Fiscal year 2024 through 2025. Total requests for sign language interpreters during detention or interrogation, 14. Total requests fulfilled within the required reasonable time frame, 2. Average response time for the 2 fulfilled requests, 11 hours. Compliance rate, 14.3%. She let the number breathe. Federal ADA guidelines specify that interpreter services during custodial proceedings should be provided within a reasonable time, generally interpreted as 1 to 3 hours. The department's average for the 2 cases where an interpreter was eventually provided was 11 hours. In the remaining 12 cases, no interpreter was ever provided. She turned to the panel. Judge Oaks was case number 13. Her detention lasted 14 hours and 11 minutes. No interpreter was provided at any point during that period, despite 11 documented requests. Marcus Reeves leaned forward. 11 requests. Documented by whom? The first 10 were documented through Judge Oaks's own written records, recovered from the wastebasket in Interrogation Room B, and from the handwritten chronology she provided to Officer Platt on the morning following her detention. The 11th was logged in the departmental system by Officer Platt at 6:27 a.m., the first and only request that was entered into the official record. And the ADA accommodation form? The one destroyed by Officer Fenn? Form SC-ADA-7, recovered in 2 pieces from the wastebasket. Evidence items 7-A and 7-B. Forensic analysis confirmed the tear pattern was consistent with manual destruction. The form was torn by hand along the horizontal center fold. Fingerprint analysis recovered latent prints from Officer Fenn on both halves. The form was complete, signed, and dated. It was a valid, executed accommodation request under departmental policy. Exhibit 9. Chain of custody documentation for body cam audio recording. Detective Ortiz presented the authentication report. Body cam unit KC-6138, assigned to Detective Bryce Kellum. Audio file downloaded from the departmental body cam server on the date of Judge Oaks's release by IT specialist Noreen Watts, badge number 7492. The file was authenticated using SHA-256 hash verification, confirming the recording had not been altered, edited, or tampered with from the point of upload to the point of download. The file was assigned Evidence Case Number USMS-WD-TN-2 025-04-12-EX-3 and maintained in continuous federal custody since retrieval. The chain of custody was unbroken. The evidence was authenticated. The recording was real, complete, and devastating. The panel deliberated. Not that day. The hearing extended across 3 sessions over 2 weeks, during which each officer's union representative presented mitigating factors, procedural arguments, and, in Stavros's case, a defense built on the premise that a captain who briefly reviewed a detention status at 3 a.m. could not reasonably be expected to conduct a comprehensive ADA compliance assessment. The deliberation itself lasted 6 weeks. Captain Buckner later described the process as thorough, which was the administrative word for agonizing. Reeves later described it as necessary, which was the civilian word for infuriating. Croft did not describe it at all, which was the union word for everything. The panel's findings were released on a Thursday in March, 97 days after the hearing commenced. Finding 1. Detective Bryce Kellum, badge number 6138. Charges sustained: failure to provide ADA-mandated accommodation, failure to deliver Miranda rights in accessible format, conduct unbecoming an officer, excessive use of intimidation during interrogation. Penalty: suspended without pay for 90 days, mandatory ADA compliance training. 40 hours, completion verified by external auditor, letter of reprimand entered in permanent personnel file, mandatory reassignment from Detective Bureau upon return from suspension. Kellum's jaw did not move when the finding was read. His attorney had told him to expect it. His attorney had also told him it could have been worse, and would be worse, if the federal criminal investigation resulted in indictment. Finding 2. Officer Darla Fenn, badge number 4721. Charges sustained: destruction of an official ADA accommodation document, falsification of property inventory records, failure to document confiscated property, concealment of evidence. Penalty: suspended without pay for 60 days, referred to the Shelby County District Attorney for potential criminal charges under Tennessee Code. Annotated Section 39-16-504, tampering with evidence, and to the U.S. Attorney's Office for potential federal charges under 18 U.S.C. Section 1519, destruction, alteration, or falsification of records in federal investigations. Fenn's attorney objected to the referral. The objection was noted. It changed nothing. Finding 3. Sergeant Nolan Trask, charges sustained: failure to document ADA accommodation requests, mischaracterization of disability as non-compliance in official records. Penalty: written, reprimand, mandatory retraining in ADA compliance and intake procedures, 12-month supervisory probation. Trask stared at the table. He had expected worse. He had gotten less, not because his conduct was less egregious than Fenn's or Kellum's, but because his role was primarily administrative, his violations primarily documentary, and the panel had drawn a distinction between active misconduct and passive negligence that Vivian's attorney would later argue was a distinction without a meaningful difference. Finding 4. Lieutenant Sheila Winsett, charges sustained: supervisory negligence, failure to ensure ADA compliance during detention under her command. Penalty: transfer from Detective Bureau Command to Administrative Services Division, letter of counseling, entered in personnel file. Winsett's transfer was lateral: same rank, same pay, different responsibilities. She would no longer oversee interrogations, detentions, or detective operations. She would manage records, schedules, and equipment procurement. The punishment was architectural, removing her from the structures where her negligence could cause harm, without removing her from the payroll. Finding 5. Captain Hugh Stavros, determination: insufficient evidence of direct involvement in ADA violations. The panel found that Stavros's 3 a.m. review of the detention status, while reflecting a problematic understanding of ADA obligations, did not constitute actionable misconduct given the brevity of his involvement and the absence of documented directives to deny accommodation. Stavros was cleared. The man who had called an interpreter a courtesy, not a requirement, who had authorized continued detention without accommodation, who had walked away from a cell containing a disabled woman who had been held for 6 hours without food, received no penalty, no reprimand, no consequence. The system had protected its own, not completely. Kellum and Fenn would carry the marks of this investigation for the rest of their careers, but partially, selectively, with the institutional instinct for self-preservation that treated accountability as a negotiation rather than an obligation. Vivian read the findings in her chambers, the document delivered by courier, printed on county letterhead with the county seal embossed in the upper left corner. She read each finding twice, set the document on her desk, aligned its edges with the desk's corner, and then she opened the second document that had arrived in the same envelope, the one that mattered more: letter from the Civil Rights Division, United States Department of Justice. Reference: preliminary assessment, Shelby County Sheriff's Office. ADA compliance, Pursuant to 34 U.S.C. Section 12601, the Department of Justice has opened a pattern or practice investigation into the Shelby County Sheriff's Office based on evidence suggesting systemic failure to provide ADA-mandated accommodations during detention and interrogation proceedings. The investigation would examine all 14 interpreter requests from the current fiscal year. It would review departmental policies, training materials, complaint records, and settlement histories. It would interview witnesses, review documentation, and produce a findings report that could lead to a federal consent decree, court-supervised reforms imposed on the department, monitored by an appointed federal observer, enforceable by contempt sanctions. The timeline: 12 to 18 months for the investigation. Findings report to follow. Negotiations with the county for consent decree terms, if warranted, to follow the findings. Implementation and monitoring, if a decree was imposed, spanning 3 to 5 years. Justice: slow, partial, procedural, maddening, and, if history was any guide, incomplete, but real, documented, irreversible. Vivian set the DOJ letter beside the IA findings. 2 documents, 2 tracks, 2 systems grinding toward accountability at speeds calibrated to institutional tolerance rather than human urgency. She picked up her pen. The Mont Blanc Colvin had returned to her at the precinct, and wrote a single word in the margin of the DOJ letter. Noted: 4 months after the detention, 6 weeks after the IA findings, 14 days after the DOJ announced its investigation. Memphis was moving on. The news cycle had processed the story. Federal judge detained 14 hours without interpreter, through its standard metabolism of outrage, analysis, opinion, and amnesia. The headlines had faded. The hashtags had expired. The public's attention had migrated to newer injustices, fresher outrages, more recent demonstrations of the gap between the system's promises and its performance. But inside the system, the gears were still turning. The Shelby County Board of Supervisors, responding to the DOJ investigation's opening announcement, authorized a departmental ADA action plan, a 37-page document produced by the county's legal department in consultation with a disability rights consultant hired on a 6-month contract. The plan outlined new policies for interpreter services, communication accommodation protocols, and officer training requirements. It included a budget request of $412,000 for interpreter contracts, assistive technology, equipment, and training program development. The budget request was submitted to the County Finance Committee. As of the plan's publication date, it had not been approved. The Finance Committee chair described the request as under review pending fiscal year reconciliation, which was the governmental phrase for we would prefer not to spend this money and are hoping the attention dies down before we have to decide. The plan also called for the creation of an ADA compliance unit within the sheriff's office, a dedicated team responsible for monitoring accommodation requests, ensuring timely response, and maintaining documentation for federal review. The unit would be staffed by, according to the plan's organizational chart, 2 full-time officers and 1 civilian specialist. In practice, the unit consisted of 1 person, Officer Corinne Platt. Platt had requested the transfer. Her request had been granted with a speed that suggested the department was happy to assign her somewhere that separated her from the colleagues who now viewed her as the officer who had started everything by running a name through a federal database instead of doing what everyone else had done, which was nothing. She occupied a desk on the 3rd floor of the Justice Center, in a former storage room that had been hastily converted into an office by the addition of a desk, a computer, a phone, and a filing cabinet. The room had no window. The computer was 3 years old. The phone rang approximately twice a week, once from the DOJ investigator assigned to the pattern or practice review, and once from Vivian Oakes's attorney, Julia Wren, checking on compliance progress. Platt did her job. She filed reports. She reviewed accommodation requests. She updated the tracking system she had built from scratch using a spreadsheet template she found online. She attended one training session, which she had organized and delivered herself, to an audience of 11 officers who spent most of the session on their phones. She was the entire institution's commitment to change, contained in one person, in one windowless room, with one outdated computer. She was what reform looked like when reform was funded by words instead of money. Kellum returned from suspension on a Monday in April, 90 days without pay, approximately $22,000 in lost income, a figure that would appear in his eventual civil liability exposure calculations alongside the much larger numbers that Vivian's civil rights lawsuit, filed by Julia Wren in federal court, would seek. He was reassigned to the property crimes desk, processing burglary reports and theft complaints. The interrogation rooms were now occupied by other detectives, younger ones, some of whom had attended the ADA training that Kellum's case had necessitated, most of whom would forget the training within 6 months because compliance without enforcement was performance, not practice. He did not apologize. He did not acknowledge wrongdoing. His union attorney had advised silence, a different kind of silence than the one he had spent 14 hours trying to break, and Kellum followed that advice with the discipline he had failed to apply to federal law. Finn's criminal referral remained pending. The Shelby County DA's office had assigned the case to an assistant DA who described the matter as under active review in every status update and took no visible action. The federal referral to the U.S. attorney was similarly pending, not declined, not charged, just suspended in the administrative amber of a system that could take years to decide whether destroying an ADA accommodation form constituted evidence tampering or merely poor judgment. Trask completed his mandatory retraining in 3 days. An online module that required clicking through 47 slides about ADA compliance, disability awareness, and communication accommodation protocols. The module included a quiz at the end. He scored 88%. He missed the question about when an interpreter must be provided during custodial proceedings, the same question his conduct had already answered, incorrectly, in practice. He returned to the booking desk. Same shift, same counter, same bulletproof glass and institutional beige. The only visible change was a laminated card taped to the lower right corner of his monitor, placed there by Platt during her compliance review, that read, "If a detainee indicates they are deaf, hard of hearing, or have a speech disability, contact the ADA compliance unit immediately." Extension 4471. Do not proceed with booking until accommodation is confirmed. The card was still there 4 months later. Whether Trask had ever called extension 4471 was unclear. Whether anyone had been booked with a hearing or speech disability during that period was also unclear, because the tracking system Platt had built relied on officers' self-reporting accommodation requests, and self-reporting required the willingness to create documentation of processes that officers had spent decades leaving undocumented. The Memphis deaf community responded to the case through channels that the hearing world rarely noticed. The Tennessee Association of the Deaf published a statement calling for statewide reform of law enforcement communication protocols. The local chapter of the National Association of the Deaf organized a silent vigil outside the Shelby County Justice Center. 200 people standing in absolute silence for 14 minutes. 1 minute for each hour of Vivian's detention, their hands raised in the ASL sign for justice, their voices absent by choice rather than biology, their silence a deliberate echo of the silence the system had imposed on one of their own. Vivian did not attend the vigil. She watched it from her chamber's window, 4 floors up, looking down at 200 pairs of hands raised in the fading afternoon light, each one speaking a language that the building she stood in had refused to hear for 14 hours, and was only now, slowly, grudgingly, beginning to acknowledge existed. She stood at that window for 9 minutes. Then she returned to her desk and continued working. Because the work continued, the work always continued. This is what justice looks like in the real world. Not a single dramatic moment, but a slow grind of paperwork, hearings, and institutional resistance. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And stay until the very end, because the last detail will change everything you think you know about what happened in that precinct. Vivian's chambers. Late afternoon. The light coming through the tall windows behind her bench had shifted from white to amber, the particular quality of Tennessee light in early spring that made old buildings look golden and new problems look ancient. She sat at her desk reviewing a sentencing memorandum in a fraud case. Routine work. The work that continued regardless of what had happened to her, regardless of what was happening to the department that had held her, regardless of what would happen in the months and years ahead as the DOJ investigation ground forward and the civil suit progressed, and the system either reformed or pretended to reform. A knock on her chamber door. Her clerk, a young woman named Dana, fluent in ASL, hired specifically because Vivian's chambers required a communication environment that the rest of the world had not yet decided to provide, opened the door and signed, "Someone is here to see you. Officer Platt from the sheriff's office." Vivian considered, then signed, "Send her in." Platt entered the way people entered judges' chambers, with a visible recalibration of their body language, a subconscious straightening that acknowledged the authority contained in the room's furniture and the person behind the desk. She was in uniform. Her hands held a manila envelope. "Judge Oaks." She stopped, swallowed, tried again. "I'm sorry to bother you. I know I probably shouldn't be here, and if this is inappropriate, I understand, and I'll leave." Vivian gestured to the chair across from her desk. Platt sat, set the envelope on the edge of the desk, then pulled it back to her lap, then set it on the desk again, the nervous choreography of someone who had something to deliver and was uncertain whether delivering it was the right decision. Dana interpreted from the corner, her hands translating Platt's words into the visual language that made this room one of the few spaces in the world where Vivian's disability was not a barrier but simply a different architecture for the same information. "I found something," Platt said, "during the compliance review. Something that I don't know if it means anything, but I thought you should see it." She opened the envelope, produced a single printed page, set it on the desk, and turned it so Vivian could read. "Internal email, Shelby County Sheriff's Office server. Recovered during the DOJ compliance review. Sender address, redacted by the department's legal counsel prior to production. Recipient, Captain Hugh Stavros, Precinct South, subject line R.E. Oaks Matter. Next." Steps. The body of the email was entirely redacted, black bars covering every line of text, except for a single sentence visible at the bottom of the page, apparently missed by whatever paralegal had performed the redaction. The 14th request was handled. Confirm the others remain closed. 14. The number of interpreter requests denied in the current fiscal year. The number that had triggered the DOJ investigation. The number that Sandra Yee, the DOJ's lead investigator, had described as the worst she had seen in a decade. Handled. Not processed, not fulfilled, not accommodated. Handled. A word that could mean anything and therefore meant something specific, something that someone at a level above Stavros had decided required action, and that the action taken was not the action that federal law required. Confirm the others remain closed. Not resolved, not completed, closed, as in sealed, as in finished, as in prevented from reopening. Vivian read the email, read it again, set it on her desk beside the sentencing memorandum, the two documents coexisting on the same surface with the surreal ordinariness of a system that produced both justice and its obstruction from the same institutional machinery. She looked at Platt, signed, "Who sent this?" Dana translated. Platt shook her head. "The sender address is redacted. Legal counsel claimed deliberative process privilege when the DOJ requested the unredacted version. It's being litigated. Could take months." Vivian signed. "And the other 13 requests? The ones that remain closed?" "I've been reviewing them." Platt's voice was steady but strained, the voice of someone carrying weight she had not expected to lift. "The files are thin. Most are just intake forms with a checkbox marked Interpreter Requested, Services Unavailable, no follow-up documentation, No explanation of what unavailable means. No record of any call to any interpreter service. In 3 cases, the intake forms were completed by the same officer, Sergeant Trask. In 2 cases, the detainees filed complaints afterward. Both complaints were marked resolved, no further action by... She stopped, looked at the email on the desk, looked at Vivian. By Captain Stavros. The name settled in the room like sediment in still water. Stavros, the captain who had been cleared by the IA panel. The captain who had called an interpreter a courtesy, not a requirement. The captain whose involvement had been deemed too peripheral for consequence, whose understanding of ADA obligations had been described as problematic but not actionable. Cleared, unpunished, still in command. And now, potentially, connected to a pattern that extended far beyond one judge's detention. A pattern of systematic denial, systematic closure, systematic handling of accommodation requests that federal law required to be fulfilled, not handled. Vivian picked up the email, held it for a moment, then placed it inside. The DOJ letter she kept in the top drawer of her desk, the letter in whose margin she had written a single word. She looked at Platt and signed, "Send this to Sandra Yee at the DOJ today." Platt nodded, took the envelope, stood, walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the frame. "Judge Oakes, for what it's worth, I'm sorry. About what happened. About all of it." Vivian signed. "You have nothing to apologize for. You were the first person in that building who looked at me and saw a person instead of a problem." Dana translated. Platt blinked, nodded, left. That evening, Vivian's phone, the Samsung Galaxy, black case, evidence item 12, returned to her after 3 months and 17 days in federal custody, sat on her kitchen counter while she made dinner. The phone had been forensically examined, the data extracted, the recordings analyzed. It had been returned in a sealed evidence bag with a custody receipt documenting every hand that had touched it since Fenn confiscated it at table 23 of the Magnolia Grill. The forensic report noted an anomaly. The phone's recording application had been active at the time of confiscation. Vivian had turned it on when the officers entered the restaurant, a precaution she had learned to take years ago. The application had recorded continuously from 8:51 p.m. until 8:59 p.m., when the phone was powered down by Officer Fenn. 8 minutes of audio, the confiscation, the ignored text display, the refusal to provide an interpreter, the handcuffing. But the forensic report also noted that the phone's recording file showed a modification timestamp of 3:27 a.m., 6.5 hours after the phone was powered down and secured in Fenn's locker. Someone had accessed the phone while it was in the locker. Someone had opened the recording application. And 43 minutes of audio, from 9:14 p.m. to 9:57 p.m., were missing. The gap covered the period between Vivian's arrival at Precinct South and the completion of her booking. The 43 minutes during which she had been processed, fingerprinted, photographed, and placed in a cell. The 43 minutes during which Trask had omitted the phone from the property inventory and Fenn had pocketed it instead of logging it. 43 minutes of evidence. Deleted. From a phone that was supposed to be secured in a locker, that was supposed to be locked in a precinct, that was supposed to be accountable. The forensic report could not determine who had accessed the phone. The locker room did not have security cameras, a policy gap that the ADA action plan did not address because the ADA action plan addressed accommodation, not evidence integrity, and the two failures were related but administratively separate, which was how systems ensured that fixing one problem never required fixing the problem next to it. Vivian read the forensic report at her kitchen table, set it beside her plate, ate her dinner, grilled salmon, roasted asparagus, brown rice, prepared with the same precision she brought to everything, and considered the 43 missing minutes. She would never hear those minutes. She could never have heard them. But someone had decided they needed to disappear anyway, not because of what Vivian might learn from them, but because of what everyone else might learn. What the DOJ might learn, what a jury might learn, what the public might learn about what happened in the booking area of Precinct South when the cameras were angled wrong and the inventory forms were incomplete and the officers believed no one was watching. Someone was still protecting the system, even now, even after the IA hearing, even after the suspensions, even after the DOJ investigation. The immune response was functioning exactly as designed. Sacrifice the cells that had been identified, protect the organism that had produced them. Vivian composed an email to Julia Wren, her attorney. The email was brief. Forensic report attached. Note the 43-minute gap and the 3:27 a.m. access timestamp. Add to the civil complaints evidence list. Copy to Sandra Yee. She sent it, closed the laptop, sat in the silence of her study. On the corner of her desk, beside a framed photograph of her late mother and a small brass scale of justice that had been a graduation gift from law school, sat an envelope. Handwritten address. No return address. Postmarked Memphis, dated 3 days ago. The letter inside was from Platt. Not the official Platt. Not the ADA. Compliance unit officer delivering evidence in a manila envelope. The personal Platt. The woman who had brought water and a granola bar to a cell at 6:22 in the morning and had changed the course of an investigation by asking a question no one else had bothered to ask. Vivian had opened the envelope that morning, had read the first 2 lines, had folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope without finishing. Not because the words were unwelcome, because the words required time, because some communications, the personal ones, the ones that existed outside the architecture of law and evidence and procedure, deserved the kind of attention that could not be given between case files and dinner preparation. She would read it later, when the house was quiet and the work was done, and the 43 missing minutes had been added to the case file and the email to Sandra Yee had been sent, and all the institutional machinery was grinding forward, and there was space, finally, for the human part. The letter sat on the desk. The silence sat in the house. And Vivian Oakes, United States District Judge, Western District of Tennessee, congenitally deaf-mute, 11 years on the federal bench, 14 hours in a county cell, 122 days into a fight she did not choose and would not abandon, sat in the space between what had been done to her and what she would do about it. The work continued. It always continued. And the silence, her silence, their silence, the silence of institutions reluctant to change and individuals afraid to speak, was not empty. It was full of everything that had been documented and everything that had not. Full of every name recorded and every name redacted. Full of every violation cataloged and every violation still hidden behind black bars on emails that might never be unredacted. Full of 43 missing minutes. Full of 14 denied interpreter requests. Full of 1 torn form. Full of 1 word written in a margin by a hand that no one could identify. 6 months after the detention. The ADA action plan was still pending budget approval. The compliance unit still had 1 officer. The DOJ investigation was in its preliminary evidence-gathering phase. The civil suit was in discovery. Fenn's criminal referral was under active review. Kellum was processing burglary reports. Winsett was managing equipment procurement. Stavros was still in command. The redacted email was still being litigated. And in Cell 4B of Precinct South, the detention log from that night had been updated. The original entry, intake 9:48 p.m., meal 0, water 1, ADA accommodation none, remained as written. But someone, at some point between the IA hearing and the DOJ investigation, had added a single word in the margin. The handwriting was small, precise, and did not match any officer on the night shift or the day shift or any shift in between. The word was written in black ink, in block letters, in the space between the printed lines of an official document that was now federal evidence in an active investigation. The word was noted. No one knew who had written it. No one claimed responsibility. The handwriting analysis was inconclusive. The sample was too small, the letters too generic, the ink too common to narrow the field. But Vivian, when she learned about it through the DOJ's evidence disclosure process, reading the detail in a footnote on page 47 of a preliminary investigative report, allowed herself one small, private reaction. She picked up her pen. The Mont Blanc. The one Colvin had carried in her pocket. The one she had used to write her first words as a free woman. She held the pen for a moment. Then she set it down, returned to her case files, and continued the work. Because the work continued. The work always continued. And silence, her silence, the silence they had tried to use against her, the silence that was both her limitation and her inheritance, was not absence. It was presence. It was the loudest thing in any room she entered. It was the sound of a woman who could not speak and did not need to, because her authority did not come from her voice. It came from the law. And the law, unlike voices, could not be silenced. End of story.
Thank you for taking the time to watch this video today. If you found the content helpful, please remember to like and subscribe so you won't miss our upcoming episodes. If you have any questions or suggestions, feel free to leave a comment below. We are always here to listen.